has permission to do that.
That's me. Sorry, I wasn't here.
Oh, that's you. Okay, great. Thanks, Eva.
No worries. Oops. I'll mute.
Okay, so it looks like we have 13 of us now. Is that around what we're expecting?
I don't think we've had a kind of booking process, so we don't really know how many people we're expecting.
Okay, well, maybe it'd be useful to go around and very briefly say who we are, where we're from, and just in one sentence, maybe one sentence, what particular fears or hopes you might have about giving the XR talk. Eva, since you're the experienced person here, do you know about the best way to facilitate online meetings like this? I haven't done this before.
Yeah, doing rounds is good, and it helps if you, I think with a group this size, it's good if you look at your screen and you just take people in order of how they appear on your screen, and you tell them the person speak and the next person, and then each time you come in and say, so people get a little bit of warning as to who's coming next.
Yeah, okay. I'm wondering would it be possible for you to be facilitator, and then I can just
I can give it a go.
That'd be great.
I'm also just needing to make dinner slightly, but it won't take very long. It's all right. I can multitask.
Multitasking, yeah, great.
So what do you want for the check-in? It's just for people to say hi and get their feelings about giving the talk, kind of hopes and or fears.
Yeah, and also should we ask people to switch their microphone off until they're doing that, so that we don't have different people popping up all the time?
Yeah, if we can all mute, it's good, because it doesn't tend to get a bit feedbacky. Right, so in order of my screen then, it would be Catherine and then Ashley.
What am I saying? My name and my hopes or fears.
Or fears.
My goodness,
I'm Catherine. I don't really have any expectations of this, so I don't know what to expect. I don't have any real hopes or fears. I hope that I'll be able to give it at some point, and that it will go well, and people will wake up to what's really going on in the world, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you. So Ashley and then Andrew, if you're there, Andrew.
Hi, I'm Ashley, West Coast of Scotland. My hopes are, that I can give it well, and people pay attention, and XR, it helps XR. My fears are I've never done any public speaking, and apparently it's worse than death. So that's just the fear of public speaking, I suppose.
Thank you. Andrew, are you able to join us for the check-in? And then Bill?
Hi, I think I'm probably logged in as Andrew. I'm meant to be logged in on behalf of Isa, my partner, who's just coming in now. So if we'll just swap over, and maybe Isa will take over. Excuse me. You need to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Isa. Oh, right. Okay.
Can you say a little bit about your hopes and or fears about giving the talk?
Well, I'm just wanting to get better at explaining what climate change is all about and what XR are doing, and to learn more about how to express that to people who maybe don't have, you know, haven't been involved, or so that's really why I'm here.
Thank you. Bill and then Anne.
I'm not sure if Bill is me. Am I the Bill you've got in mind?
Yes, that's what it says. Bill Barlow, it says on your screen.
Well, I'm Bill, and I'm here with and Naomi, and we're part of a group in the southwest Scotland, in Auchencairn, which is loosely connected with XR. And we had a meeting last night, and we were discussing giving public meetings around the place, and we realised that we should avail ourselves of all that you've done and actually try and learn. I've watched the videos. We've all watched the XR videos, and it'd be good if we could pass it on. So it's really useful, very timely that it's just come right now. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Could we ask, is it Iletta to mute her microphone for the time being, please?
Okay. So Anne and then Lucas.
Hello, I'm Anne. I hope that I'll be able to deliver this talk as much as possible. We've just got the council to declare a climate emergency, which we're very excited about. But we were also, one of the things we discussed with them was giving the talk in all the community council areas, and or as many as will have us, and having discussions so that we can make people aware of the what's really going on. And so we need lots of people to be trained, so hopefully, yeah, that's what I'm here for.
Thank you. Lucas and then Julian.
Hello. Hey. Yeah, so just really hoping that this training goes well, and I feel fully equipped to give the talk, to get kind of everyone climate literate and able to communicate science in an effective way.
Thank you. Julian and then Kat.
Yeah, hi, I'm Julian. So I've got to do a very simple intro talk on Monday, so I'm hoping that at least listening to this training will help me with that. That's one of my hopes. One of my fears actually is overcommitting, so so I'm just going to take it as it comes and see what I can manage. So that's me.
Thank you, Kat. And then Colin, do you want to check in too?
Kat here from Edinburgh. I have heard the talk several times and have been scared of doing it, so I'm listening again for an easy, quick way of doing it. Haha. I suppose my fears are the sounds and the questions that people ask that I will not be able to answer them. Thanks.
Colin and then Caitlin.
Hi, so my name's Colin. I've given the talk quite a few times now, although I still feel like I'm learning how to do it, but hopefully my experience will be helpful for others in thinking about how to go about tackling it. It is quite a challenging talk, but it's also quite a rewarding one to give, so I'm looking forward to for us to have a nice discussion about it.
Thank you, Caitlin, and then John Hardy.
Hi everyone. I'm Caitlin. I'm here in Edinburgh. I'm a National Sustainability Manager for NHS Scotland. We're just developing a new sustainability strategy, which is not particularly ambitious, as you can imagine. I have a hard job communicating this within the NHS. It's amazing that we still don't see the connection between health and climate change. So really just looking for some inspiration. And as a few other people have said, it's just one of those subjects that for people who have no conscious awareness of what's happening, how to communicate that in a positive way.
Thank you. So John, oh, there you are. These guys keep moving around. It's just proving a little bit of a challenge. John and then Isa.
Yeah, thanks, Eva. Yeah, my name's John. I'm in Edinburgh. I guess I have similar sort of fears as mentioned earlier in terms of the science. Really, it's more just kind of facts and figures and numbers and things that I'm not great with. So that would kind of be my biggest worry.
Thank you, Isa, and then Alex.
Oh, I spoke earlier because my computer didn't support this video, so I had to log in through my husband's computer. So I've already said what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'd not made that connection. So what did I say? Who is coming next? You people moving around. Oh, Alex, you're down there now. And then Ileta. So Alex, and then did I say your name right? Ileta?
Sorry, it's Isabel.
Isabel. Okay. Yeah. So Alex, and then you. Alex, you were muted. Were you saying something? Alex C, I don't know if you can hear me.
Good to be here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hello?
Can hear you.
Hello? Okay. Distributing we actually had we haven't had the official introductory XR talk yet, but we're just keen to get as much exposure to either learning to give the talk or, listening, if that's okay.
Thank you. You got a bit of a bandwidth problem there. I hope you managed to follow. Okay, so Isabel, and then Chris.
Okay, apologies.
It's freezing, doesn't she? It's not going to.
You're muted, Isabella.
Oh, because she told to turn it off, doesn't she?
Now do you hear me? Do you hear me? You hear me now? Yeah. So I'm Isabelle Letelier. My hope is to be able to communicate as well as possible the truth about climate change. But I'm afraid of getting lost in all the details, and I'm not a climate scientist, so am I legitimate to talk about all this in details? And as I have some area of expertise, and I feel I could have a tendency to get my own argument to feel more authentic, because then I'm authentic in saying that. But yeah, so how to balance so I can get to something I believe in. Yeah, to embody the talk. So that's my question.
Thank you. Chris and then Evie. You're muted, Chris. No, you weren't muted actually, but we can't hear you. Shall we leave you and come back to you at the end? Okay. So Evie and then Ash, we've done you, Ashley, haven't we? You're jumping about people. Who's not spoken? Oh no, your sound isn't working either. Okay. Yes, it actually is working, but something's gone wrong with it. It's very buzzy. Technical points from Julie and Catherine. One of you?
So I'm still getting a lot of pops and crackle and interference. I'm wondering if people without their microphones muted can mute them, please.
Yeah, I think that was Evie's one. So I think that it's just Chris who hasn't spoken. Is that right?
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yay! I had the wrong webcam plugged in. So I'm Chris. I'm from Edinburgh. I see there's quite a few people in here from Edinburgh. I really just want to learn how to speak a bit more confidently in front of a group of people who might be interrogating me later. That's why I'm here.
Thank you. So I'll check in. I'm Eva. I've joined because I was asked to speak about the Citizens Assembly project, which I will do later on. And I am a little bit overcommitted at the moment, so I am hoping to stay for the whole thing, but I may need to drop out after I've spoken. So apologies in advance if I do that. That's because I'm knackered. Over to you, Colin.
Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear me as well. This is Leo from Bristol. I've snuck in, south of England. So I'm sort of hopeful that I'll be able to communicate the science in a clear way and inspire people to take action like I was. I guess sort of fearful about balancing my sort of natural enthusiasm with the seriousness of the topic and not making people think it's a bit flippant, like that sort of balance really. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Eva, for helping to facilitate all that. I really appreciate that. Hopefully, everyone can hear me. Actually, Eva's frozen on my screen, but that's okay. And it'd be good if, and be good if everyone can maybe mute their microphone for now. Having said that, when I've done this training session before, which has always been in the flesh, as it were, rather than online, the best part about it, from my view, is the discussions that we have going. So I really do want to encourage people to speak up and talk about the talk. I'm interested in people's views, and so that's why it's so helpful if Eva or if Eva has to go, maybe someone else could step in. So that if there's someone who can monitor the different cams and then if someone wants to speak, then maybe they can raise a finger, and then I'm happy for people to interrupt at any point and ask a question.
I'm happy to do that for the moment, and I see that Evie is wanting to try again. Is that right? No? Oh, sorry, I thought you had a hand up. Are you typing in the chat maybe? No. There is a chat place where you could type in comments if you want to.
Because on your picture, the option to.
Oh, yeah, right. I can see there's a chat. Let me turn that on. Oh, so there's a good tip from Lucas. So you can use spacebar to toggle between muting and unmuting. So that's useful. Okay. So one quick preliminary. I am a member of the XR speaker group, and one thing that group likes to do is to try to keep track of the people who have attended speaker training sessions. So to allow us to do that, maybe the easiest way would be at some point, maybe immediately after this session, if you could send me an email. You don't really have to say anything in it other than just to send me the email so that I have your email address and then I can add it. Actually, no, it'd be useful to have both your email address, your full name, and then your location. And then we can add that to a spreadsheet. And what we'll do with that is that we have a log of who has received some training. If then we have a request for speaking where you are, then someone may get in touch with you. And they won't necessarily expect that you're immediately ready to give the talk, but they might at least say, would you like to help give the talk? So that's very useful for us. There is also a Facebook group for XR speakers. I can't actually really tell you anything about that because I'm not on Facebook. But if you can't find it, then let me know and I'll see if I can send you a direct link. I will also, once I have everyone's email address, send you a link to the official slides. One thing I would say about that at the outset is that, yeah, there are a set of official slides. In fact, there have been a number of different official slides over time, but we have recently released a new set, and they look really nice, I think. Having said that, I always tend to customize the slides I use a little bit. And as we'll talk about in a moment, I do encourage people to try to make the talk their own, to bring something of their own individual authenticity to the talk. But it's good to use those official slides certainly as the template from which to work. And some people might use just exactly those slides, and that's great. And the other nice thing about those slides is that they include within the notes section a possible script that you can use. But we'll also talk later on about the dangers of working from a script. So it was very useful for me to hear from you about some of your hopes and fears, and particularly fears. I mean, a lot of people have concerns about giving the talk, quite understandably. And those concerns are sometimes just general issues about public speaking. And it's natural that people should have those concerns because, you know, whenever you look at these lists of the things that people are most anxious about, speaking in public always tends to figure pretty highly on those lists. But the good news there is that that is something that one can get over and get much better at. And so one of the things that we're going to try to do in this session is just to give some general advice about public speaking that I hope will be useful. But then another concern that I heard raised by a few people relates to the science and a concern about whether or not you are sufficiently knowledgeable about the science in order to be able to give this talk. And that's a concern I've heard very frequently, and it's, again, a very legitimate concern. At the same time, what I'd like to say about that is I really don't think you should worry about that. And in fact, I think over time, there's been even less reason to worry about that. But we will talk more about that, both from a general perspective of where you should position yourself relative to the science, but also about some of the, you know, what I think are some of the key aspects of science to communicate. But the overall story is it's not really about the science. You can appeal to the authority of the experts rather than trying to sell yourself as the expert. And a number of people talked about authenticity, which is a very important point, which I'd like to spend some time on. And there are also concerns about questions, which is an interesting thing for us to consider as well. How you handle a Q&A session, whether you should even have a Q&A session. Some people would say perhaps you don't need to have one. Okay. So the overall plan then is I wanted to spend a very short time thinking about the bigger picture as an introduction, and then we'll have a section on some general advice on public speaking. And then I think would be a good chance for Eva to tell us more about citizens' assemblies. I'm really interested to hear about that myself. And then after that, we can talk about some specific advice about the Extinction Rebellion talk. In fact, let me just clarify that at the outset because I want to avoid any confusion. Throughout this session, I'm going to be talking about the talk, and I hope everyone appreciates that the talk that I'm referring to is the talk called Heading Towards Extinction and What to Do About It. Is there anyone who hasn't seen that talk? If you haven't, maybe if you could, I can't actually see everyone's face at the moment because I minimize that part of the screen, but maybe feel free to unmute yourself and let us know if you haven't seen the talk yet.
I haven't seen it yet.
Okay, thanks.
I haven't seen it.
Okay, so that's Isa, where am I? Isa and Catherine.
I've only seen a short. We had a shortened version a couple of times.
Okay, so short version.
And I can see that Alex is trying to say that he hasn't, and the people watching with him hasn't seen it, but his bandwidth is so rubbish he can't say it.
Okay. All right. Well, it's better if people have seen the talk, obviously, because some of the things I might say, you might. It might be a bit harder to follow, not having seen the talk. But I will attempt, when we go onto that section, just to give you a very brief précis of the talk. And then your homework will be, after the session, to watch one of the versions of the talk that's available online. There are several different versions available on YouTube that you can watch. But just a brief thing about that. This is the main recruitment talk that we have in Extinction Rebellion. And it has effectively two parts, as the title suggests. The first part, Heading Towards Extinction, it's about the path we're on. It's about explaining the climate and ecological emergencies. And then the second part, What to Do About It, is about explaining about Extinction Rebellion, about the theory of change within XR, and our specific plans. And many of you will have seen versions of the talk prior to April. And one of the things maybe I'll try to talk a little bit about are ways in which we might tweak the talk post-April, because obviously we're not going to be talking so much about the plan for what we'll do in April, but maybe we will talk a little bit about what remains to be done, which is obviously quite a lot. Okay, and then following that, I'll also spend a little bit of time talking about the logistics and admin of giving the talk, which isn't necessarily my specialty, but is very important. Because this is a recruitment talk, it's really important that when people come to the talk, we try to then capture their details at the end of the talk, have a way to communicate with them after that. And then maybe we can also talk a little bit about the role that the talk can play in laying the foundations for setting up a new group. Increasingly, what we're trying to do in Bristol is form a whole bunch of local groups. So, we now have Bristol Central, Bristol North, Bristol South. Soon we'll have Bristol East, Bristol West, Bristol Northwest. And we see the talk as the first step there. We target the area that we want to have a new group. We go and give the talk there. And then the following week, we have inductions and so on. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that later on. Okay, so, as I mentioned at the outset, a slight disclaimer. I've given the talk myself quite a lot of times. I'm not sure exactly how many now, but I think it's in the double figures. So I feel pretty confident giving it, but, I think all of us are still experimenting. And I'm comfortable doing that. My day job is as an experimental psychologist. I'm a professor of psychology, and I'm quite interested in the psychology behind the talk. And every time I give it, one of the things I'm trying to do is tweak things a little bit and try and observe the effect it has. And I encourage you to try and do that as well. So I hope some of the things I'll talk about will be useful and you'll find them helpful. There might be some things where you think, well, no, I don't think that applies to me, or I can't use that. In which case, fine. Just take what you think is useful and apply that. So,
Hello.
Yes.
Evie was asking. I think what she was asking was about to like what are the, and you may be going to speak about this later, what are the, how much can you change the talk so to make it your own?
Yes, well, I will talk about that later, but just to respond briefly, there's a balance here. So on the one hand, there are people in the talks and training group who are very concerned that the talk doesn't change too much, that everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet, as it were, and that people don't go off on their own particular hobby horses. You know, for instance, people would be quite concerned if, for example, if a speaker decided that they wanted to spend a lot of time talking about how everyone should go vegan in response to the climate emergency. At the same time, I think it's really important for people to feel like they own the talk and that they're not simply delivering someone else's message, that this is authentically them. And so I will talk a bit more on that. And I feel that people should be able to modify bits of the talk, maybe include some of their own images. There might be certain sections of the talk where you think you've got something special to contribute and you can spend a little bit more time on. So absolutely, I think people should be able to customize things a little bit, provided that you don't go too far away from the basic structure of the talk. And one of the things that I hope we can really nail down in this session is make sure that everyone understands the structure of the talk, the recipe, as it were, how it is that it works. And once you understand that, then I think there's a lot more scope for you to be able to play around with it. A bit like, once, if you're a cook and you're making something the first time you do it, maybe you should follow the recipe. But once you've done that, then you can feel free to change the seasonings a little bit and do it your own way. Okay. Are there any other questions before I go on?
Can I just, we have talked about talking to particular groups, so we thought that maybe sometime if we got an opportunity to talk to school children, then you might need to modify it in different ways. So yeah, we've just sort of had to think about that, but I don't know whether we've got any answers.
Yes, thanks. That's an interesting question. So I will talk very briefly about trying to tailor the talk to different audiences. I'll also talk about children, and in fact, I'll suggest maybe this particular talk isn't one that you should deliver to children. But I think it is an interesting project to think about, well, what kind of talk should one be delivering to children? But that won't be my focus in this session. But certainly, if someone's trying to do that, I'd be very interested to find out more about what they're doing and maybe to feedback on it. Okay, so here's an initial question that I'd like people to consider. And it's one of those questions that seems like it should be obvious, but actually, in my experience, once people start talking about it, they realize that maybe it's not quite so obvious. There's different ways to think about it. So here's the question. Why are we giving this talk? What is the point of giving the Heading Towards Extinction talk? So I'll give you a minute to think about that, and then I'm interested in sampling people's responses to that. Okay, so does someone want to go first? Why are we giving this talk? Yeah, Julian, I see has his finger up.
For me personally, I'm always thinking about everything I do in XR in terms of the 3 demands. So basically, if it's not supporting the 3 demands within the framework of the principles, I've got questions about its relevance. So that's the way I kind of focus my mind.
You mean about trying to communicate the 3 demands, or it's an aspect of one of those demands about telling the truth?
Yeah, so it's about achieving the demand. So obviously communicating in order to do that. So just to keeping the communication focused on that purpose. Yeah. So seeing the communication as a means to those ends rather than a means to some other end.
I can see that. Oh yeah, thanks. I think Eva's there, right? So are you facilitating, Eva?
Yes, sorry, I dropped the ball for a second, but I'm back.
No, sorry. I think I took over your role. Sorry about that.
It's fine. Kat first, and then Lucas, and then Anne.
Kat here. I think in many ways it's a complicated concept. And I think I would like to be able to communicate it to people who are kind of like me, who don't have a scientific background, but to get them to understand the reasons why I and everybody else are doing XR and why it's important.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Lucas, and then Anne.
Yeah, so for me, and the reason I want to give this talk is just to, not only within the framework of Extinction Rebellion and getting those 3 demands met, but just so that people understand the science of what's going on, so that maybe even if they don't want to be involved with XR, you know, they might get involved with other groups who are kind of trying to achieve similar kind of goals to XR. And just so people really understand that, because it's really shocking how little people do understand, how little I understood until I went to this talk, you know, about the real gravity of this. So whatever kind of people do afterwards, I think it's just really important that everyone understands first.
Thank you. Anne and then Chris.
Yes, I'd echo that. I think that there's a huge amount of ignorance out there, and people really need to wake up. And I think this very powerful way of waking people up and telling the truth, which is one of the demands.
Thank you, Chris, and then the lady who's called Andrew.
Yeah, mine is to awaken people to the reality, but then importantly, give them the tools of hope to be and bring the changes that are necessary.
Thank you. Lady called Andrew. What's your name again?
Isa.
Isa, yes, I'm really sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'm sorry about that mix up. No, I just feel that we have been taught, you know, the information about climate change has been around for so long, and I suppose up to now we sort of hope that our politicians and our media and would disseminate this information that everybody needs to start talking about. And it just hasn't happened, and so I feel, well, if they are not going to do it, then I suppose we will have to. And I don't feel particularly qualified, but I feel there is no really other option, because we need to change the narrative.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So, the 2 main kind of categories.
Elizabeth looks like she's suddenly really keen to speak.
Yeah. So sorry, I thought we were going through everybody. Yeah. So I didn't say I'm from Sweden. I'm based in Sweden. I'm French. But so for me in Sweden, we are very concerned about making people understand that there's a need for political mobilization. So my aim is really about telling the truth about climate change, but making people feel that we need to go to political action. That collective action to demand political change is the way, and that's for me that's the main concern, because climate anxiety is quite prominent in Sweden, but the connection to activism and mobilization is totally not there.
Great, thank you.
More? No? Okay.
Okay, that's really useful, thanks. So, I think the two main categories I heard there was people saying that they want to raise awareness, they want to wake people up, they want to communicate something about the science and about the seriousness of the situation, which is great. And then the other one was about telling people more specifically about XR, communicating the demands of XR, making sure people are aware of the importance of political mobilization. So those are both great. Now, another way to think about those things, again, in terms of this as a recruitment talk, is, if you imagine the circle of people who are not currently within Extinction Rebellion, then one way to think about this is that you'd like to take some of those people and bring them into this circle of people who are in Extinction Rebellion. Okay, but I think as people were talking about, it's not even necessarily about that. So in some cases, we accept that the people in this original circle, they're not going to move into XR, but they will at least be somewhat sympathetic to people who are rebels, and they'll understand a little bit more about what those people are doing, why it is they're blocking traffic, and so on. But we can maybe try to break down this bigger non-XR circle a little bit more and say, well, there are some people who are actually quite familiar with the science, or at least with the idea that there is a climate emergency. And then there are other people who are maybe not so familiar with that, but they're on board with the idea of taking action. For instance, there might be people who have been involved in the campaign for nuclear disarmament or other direct action movements, and so they're very much ready to go along and take part in some action, but they haven't yet become aware of just how serious the climate and ecological emergencies are. So these are two different sub-circles within that non-XR circle, and of course there's some overlap between them. And so we're trying to communicate different things to those different segments. One group needs to know just how serious these emergencies are. The other group, they already know about that, but they need to be told what to do about it. And that's what the two parts of the talk are about, right? So one is heading towards extinction. This is the path we're on. The other one is what to do about it. And they are, in some respects, communicating to different people. Whenever you have people coming to the talk, there will be some people, well, quite a lot of the audience, who'll say about part one, yeah, I already knew that. And it's part two where they're getting the bit that's really valuable for them. And then there'll be other people who just had no idea about how serious the situation that we're in is. And so for them, part one will be a real eye-opener, and possibly part two as well, but that's the bit that will really linger with them. So I've been talking about this non-XR part of the circle, but what about the people who are already in XR? Maybe actually the talk can be aimed at them as well, because you'll often have people who have already been to XR meetings or know at least a bit about XR coming along. And the talk can serve the purpose of communicating to them and influencing them. And it relates to the theory of change that Extinction Rebellion has. And, I think actually Emily mentioned that this is something that maybe we could talk about a bit more. But people are aware that there is a big emphasis on people getting arrested, which is not to say that everyone has to get arrested. In fact, it's very important that not everyone does get arrested. But when people talk about, well, in what sense was the international rebellion, the part of it that was in London, successful, people point to the fact that we had 11 or 1,200 people arrested, whatever it was. That is seen to be a key part of how we evaluate our ability to affect change. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is to get people who are, if you like, on the periphery of XR or see themselves as kind of less involved in that, to move them a little bit more towards the center, push them a little bit more towards thinking, well, actually, maybe I could consider the possibility of getting myself arrested. Or maybe the people who, so far all they've done is they've liked something on Facebook, but they might actually be persuaded to get a little bit more involved, even if that's not being arrested. So then that's a different kind of audience again. But one other point that I'd like to make about why we give the talk is that this is the way that we actually get people involved. If it was just about having people watch the talk, then presumably what we could do is say, well, let's just let's refine this until we've got it just right, and then we'll record it and we'll put it on YouTube and we'll send a link to everyone and everyone can watch the talk, and then they'll be persuaded by that and they'll come along to a meeting. Actually, though, that's not what happens. And I know that from my own experience. So I first saw the talk online. I saw Gail Bradbrook's version and I watched it in September last year. And coming into it, I had no idea what it was I was about to see. I'd never heard of Extinction Rebellion before or Gail Bradbrook. The talk was suggested to me. It was, it's one of these suggestions that YouTube gave, which turned out to be quite a clever suggestion. And, I was not watching this under ideal conditions. There was no one around. When it started, I was half reading something else. But over the course of it, I was really, I found it very compelling. And by the end of it, I thought, well, it sounds like these guys are onto something. And so I immediately signed up and sent my email address along and waited to hear back from someone. But of course, this was fairly early days and there probably weren't very many people doing this. I hope this has changed a bit now, although I sometimes don't have entire confidence that it has. But of course I waited, nothing ever happened. And, the rebellion was declared and people were on the bridges. And I was, being a useless academic, I was tweeting support, but I hadn't gone to a meeting. And I didn't go to my first meeting until I happened to go along to some demonstration about local buses. And there was someone there from XR. And I thought, oh, here's a real person who's part of Extinction Rebellion. I went along and I spoke to her and she said, you should come along to a meeting. And so next week I was there. The week after that, I was preparing to give the talk. So things moved very rapidly from there. But I cannot overemphasize the importance of the human factor. And that's why it's so important that, you all learn about giving the talk, and hopefully some of you will then feel confident to go and give the talk, because you then will provide that human factor. You'll be that person of whom others in the audience can say, oh yeah, here's a real person from Extinction Rebellion, and they're encouraging me to come along to a meeting. Okay, so the talk is very powerful, even under quite unfavorable conditions, but to really close the deal, it's good to be there in person. So I want to try and give some general advice now about public speaking, because it is something that people get quite concerned about. I think the most important thing I can tell you about public speaking is that your power comes from your authenticity. So if you can deliver a talk and have people think, yes, this person really believes what they're saying, this is really them speaking, then it will be powerful. That's the thing that you want to try to communicate. It has to be your voice speaking. And that can be quite challenging because, of course, it won't be you who has written the talk, at least not the standard version. And the other thing that can be challenging about it, which is something that people have alluded to, is that there is some climate science in the talk, and presumably you are not a climate scientist. I don't think anyone mentioned they were. And so you might feel like, oh, am I able to talk about that authentically? And it's really important that in preparing for the talk, you know, you'll probably read some climate science, or some of you will, and you might get quite interested in it. And then there might be a temptation for you to speak to the audience as if you were an expert on climate science. And I encourage you, you know, I mean, to the extent that you develop some expertise, that's great, and you can communicate that. But don't pretend to be a climate scientist if you're not, because you will then be losing that really critical authenticity. So one of the things that I like to say when I'm giving a talk is that my main qualification for giving the talk is simply that I believe in the message of this talk. I think it's really important, and I want to try to spread it to as many people as I can. And you know, that's what people want to hear. The people who come along to the talk as well will tend to be somewhat self-selecting. You know, we'll talk a bit more about this later on, but it's very unlikely that you're going to have people coming along who are really not interested in hearing about what Extinction Rebellion are doing. So they want to hear from someone who is passionate about believing it, and they don't necessarily expect that person to be a climate scientist or an expert in social change or what have you. One of the things that I'd say about authenticity is that it can be, for people who are not experienced speakers, sometimes there's a temptation to try to model oneself on someone else. You know, you see someone else give a talk, you know, like a TED talk or something, and you think, right, that's the way to give a talk. And certainly you can get some good tips by watching other speakers, that's helpful, but don't try to adopt someone else's style, because if you do that, then there's a good chance your audience will be able to tell, and even if it's only subconsciously, they'll feel like, well, somehow this isn't this person speaking. You know, if it feels like there's some jarring moment between before you start the talk and then when you start talking, that suddenly you turn into a different person, then that will affect this authenticity, which is so important. Now, something else that's related to what I've been saying is the importance of humility. You know, I think that's something that is very powerful in a speaker. So, yeah, a lot of people are concerned about, do I have the expertise to be able to deliver the talk? Well, I think there's potentially a danger there that you may slip into the trap of trying to adopt the pose of an expert who knows best. And actually, it's much more powerful if you can try to be humble about it and just say, you know, this is what I think. This is what I'm trying to do. Very much the emphasis should be not on, I've studied the science and I know what's best. I figured out what we have to do. This is what you should do. Rather, it's, you know, I've gotten deeply into this, and as a consequence of that, this is what I'm going to do and why I'm going to do it. So I think humility is a very powerful thing. I don't want to suggest that you should push that too far. So, you know, don't go to the extreme of apologizing for not being an expert or for not being sufficiently prepared or not good enough, because that kind of thing is just a distraction to your audience. The other nice thing about a little bit of humility is it can help to break down some of the barriers between you and your audience. probably it will be the case that you'll be in a room where you'll be standing up and everyone else will be sitting down, and because of the social conventions, there'll be a sense in which you are the expert. You're the person who's holding the floor, and that builds in this barrier between sorry, I'm slightly distracted by what's happening on either screen. So that can build in this barrier between speaker and audience, and as much as possible, it's good if you can break that down a little bit. You know, there's a fine line here. For those people who have worries about giving the talk, they may often find those barriers quite useful. You know, if you're worried about, someone talked about before about being interrogated by an audience. I don't think you have to worry about that. But, you know, if for anyone who has those kinds of concerns that, oh, someone's going to think I've got something wrong, they're going to interrupt me and so on, there can be a tendency to want to try and exploit that power relationship that naturally exists. You know, so I'm the person standing up and being the expert, and I have the floor, and other people then have to be quiet and listen to me. Well, I would encourage you, to the extent that you feel comfortable, to try and break down some of those barriers and encourage a little bit more discussion, because in many ways, although the talk itself is really important, I think the conversations that people end up having over the course of the time that they're in that room are just as important. Conversations that probably won't even involve you. You know, I think it's good to encourage people to turn at some point to their neighbor and have them having some conversations, and those are really important. Does anyone have any questions before I go on? Do feel free to interrupt at some point if you'd like to ask anything, or if you've got a comment to make.
I know that Alex had a question about scripts, and whether there's a script somewhere.
So there is a script associated with the current version of the slides, and that's a useful thing to look at. But one of the things that I'll try to advise you in a moment is not to be too bound to the script. But yes, we will talk about that.
Bill has a question, and Ashley.
Right.
You're muted, Bill. There you go.
Oh, unmute myself. Is that it?
Yeah.
I don't know how we did it, but we did it. The thing that I just wanted to say was that, speaking slightly from a traitor point of view, but you know, we had a meeting last night in a local group which is concerned about climate change deeply and sincerely, and it's not particularly XR group as such, and I mean, I'm really fascinated by it. I mean, I found the talk incredibly powerful, and the material in it is imperative to be conveyed everywhere. I'd like to think that it doesn't have to be presented in an XR context, because it's, you know, that we can use the material in part one without necessarily being wedded to the methods that XR adopts. There was a lot of talk about locally from one of the people there has part of a group in Cornwall where they've been phoning around all their local councillors. They've been getting on, making a huge impression locally, trying to get all their local councils to sign up to declaring a climate emergency in their own area. They didn't they didn't come under the banner of XR particularly, and I think it's really powerful that people can speak, you know, that it's not a thing that's only owned by XR, that it is it's of universal significance. It's so important that it can be broadcast in any which way. That was it. And something. There we go. I've said enough.
Thank you. Do you have a response, Colin?
Yeah. So, I mean, absolutely. It's not that XR owns the science. A lot of the material in part one obviously overlaps to a great extent with other talks about the climate crisis or the ecological crisis. We will talk in a moment about some of the psychology of the talk. And one thing I can foreshadow there is something extremely unorthodox about the Heading for Extinction talk, in that, the conventional wisdom in climate communication is that you shouldn't be too scary, you shouldn't be too negative. And the reason for that is that if you do that, the audience will kind of put up the barriers, and it will just be too much, it'll be overwhelming. People will be left feeling powerless, and they may even do things that are counterproductive. So it's an interesting thing about the talk that it says, no, actually, we want people to feel those negative emotions. The reason that works, I think, is because you then follow that with something that is commensurate in scale. If you were to give part one and say, oh, we're in a really terrible situation, and then in part two say, and so we all have to switch off the lights, well, that's obviously not going to work. But if you say, and so that means we need radical system change, and this is how we think we might be able to achieve it, well, then that's quite powerful. So you talked about the idea of, well, you could use part one to try to motivate climate emergency. And I think that's interesting. So I wouldn't disagree with that. But I guess the key point is that it's only really the XR talk, Extinction Rebellion talk, if it includes that part two. But if people want to make use of some of the stuff in part one, then by all means, they should do that. But do be aware that there is a danger that you're manipulating your audience into a particular emotional state, and then you need to be careful about the way you do that and what you then give them following that, having got them into that state. And we'll talk a bit more about that later on. There was another question from Ashley, was it?
Yes, I was just wondering, when you were talking about getting people to talk to each other, asking questions during the talk, is that during the talk, when they'll probably just be talking to the people that they came with, and so so we'll have similar ideas because they probably discussed it before they arrived? Or do you mean kind of after the talk, where and try and encourage people to talk to people that they don't know, so that there is an exchange of different ideas?
Yes, exactly. It's not it's not especially helpful for them just to talk to people they already know, although they may still be having conversations they wouldn't normally have. But I try to encourage people to talk to each other at the end of part one. I'll say a little bit more in a moment about what should come between parts one and two. But yes, I think that's a good point. And then also at the end of part two as well, possibly. And yes, I try to encourage people to talk to people they don't know. That won't always be possible, but it's a good thing to aim for. I mean, we've touched on this.
Sorry, Evie has a question. You need to unmute. There you go. Oh, I'm really sorry, it's still not working. If you want to write it into the chat, we can see it and read it for you. You can't find the chat. You can, but it's not working either. Oh, Jesus, how annoying. Really sorry.
We can see you, so if it's short and you could write it on a bit of paper.
Well, you could mime it. She has been. It actually comes out in mirror writing, what you put up. So there's a challenge for you.
All right, well, yeah, do persist. And it's possible that we'll come to your question later on anyway. So I started to talk a little bit about the emotional content of the talk. So maybe that's a good point to mention that one of the challenges, I think, of this talk is to try and make sure that you match your own attitude to the particular content. And I mean, that's important because emotion is central to this talk. I think it's been known for quite a long time that it's not sufficient to just give people the facts. You have to make people experience some kind of emotional response in order to have them then, in order to have them understand why it is that you're suggesting that some people are going to get arrested, maybe some people are going to go to prison. In order to have that call to action, you want people to actually experience an emotional response. I mean, that's important even if they don't join XR, because there's an important aspect of a grieving process that I think everyone should be maybe starting to go on. One of the things that makes it difficult, though, is that the emotions in the talk change throughout. And maybe I'll say a little bit more about that later on. But because different parts of the talk then have different emotional states associated with them, you need to try and make sure that you follow that yourself. And it's partly that you want the audience to see you experiencing that emotional journey, because then that will make it more easy for them to participate in it. There was a question about the script. Yes, so there is a script, and I encourage you to have a look at it. I didn't write this script, and I don't think I've actually even read it. Probably I should have done. But the main thing I would say about that is what I really don't want people to do is to print the script out and then go along and give the talk and say the next thing I'm going to talk about is, and then just read it from notes. There's two reasons not to do that. One is that it's very hard for your audience to focus on what you're saying if they don't have some kind of eye contact from you. It's just quite boring if people are reading from notes. But the other reason relates to what we were talking about before, about that sense of authenticity and the concerns people have, because what it communicates, I think, to your audience, if you're reading from a script, is that maybe you have a lack of knowledge, a lack of expertise, and that will make them less comfortable in following along with this journey. Because both parts of this talk involve messages that many people are going to be highly resistant to. They're going to be resistant to part one because, the brief précis of part one is we're fucked. So, people don't necessarily want to hear that. And then the brief précis of part two is we need to engage in mass civil disobedience. Some people need to get arrested. And, if people haven't been prepared for that, then that's also going to be quite challenging. That's going to be less of a problem now, of course, because, people know about Extinction Rebellion now. People know about lots of people getting arrested, so that won't come as such a surprise. Nevertheless, they will likely have a bit of a resistance to the idea of themselves participating in that. And so anything that allows them to say, well, this person, they don't really know what they're talking about, that's something that they may latch onto if they want to resist the message. Now, I don't want to say that you shouldn't rely to some extent on prompts when you speak. And a good way to do that can be to include some words on your slides, not in the sense of putting your script on the slides. Please, don't do that. But, you can use the titles of the slides, maybe a couple of bullet points on the slides in a way that's useful for your audience. It gives them keywords. If their attention drifts at some point, then they can see that and remind themselves where you're at. But it's also useful for you. It helps to prompt you as you're going along. The other place that, the other respect in which it's useful to have words is sometimes it's nice to have quotations. So, we've talked about the idea of people have concerns about the science and whether they have science expertise. I think the main thing you can do in response to that is say, well, let's have a quotation from one of the world's leading climate scientists. Have a few. And in that way, you can say, look, it's not me saying this. It's not me saying that we have to stay below 1.5 degrees. You know, this is something that has been said by the UN expert panel on the subject. So, yeah, by all means, have some words on your slides, but don't use them as a script. So, you know, that raises the question then, if you're not going to be reading from your notes, from your slides, how is it that you're going to know what to say? And you can probably guess what the answer to that question is going to be. It's practice. You simply have to practice giving the talk a lot. And practice is important for a few reasons. One is so that you can just become really familiar with the talk, and hopefully, you know, if you do the talk a few times for yourself, maybe in front of a mirror, for a friend, then it becomes so familiar so that when you ultimately deliver it, it is just like you're having a conversation. You know, you're speaking naturally. To that end, one bit of advice I'd give you is that when you're practicing giving the talk, it's good to have the mindset that you're not trying to remember a particular form of words. Sometimes people worry that, you know, particularly if you've got a script, that what they have to do is to commit to memory this precise form of words. And that's not what it's about. In fact, I'd actively encourage you to try to say things a little bit differently every time you practice the talk, so that then when you're in that situation of delivering it, you are just speaking naturally, and it might be a little bit different each time, but you'll have the main message there. And then, of course, the other reason for practicing the talk, particularly for people with less experience of public speaking, is that it gives you the opportunity to get more comfortable with presenting. And so for that reason, it is a good idea when you're practicing, not simply to look at the slides and, you know, say it to yourself in your head, but actually to stand up, you know, maybe initially do it in front of the mirror, then do it for a sympathetic friend, maybe do it for 2 or 3, and gradually build up until you get more and more comfortable giving it. Because public speaking, it's just one of those things where it's very scary the first time you do it, and the more and more you do it, the more comfortable you get with it. And the only way that you get to that point is through practice. And you want to make sure that you have that practice before the first time that you do it for real, as it were. Anyone have any questions or comments relating to that?
I find it quite helpful to record myself on an iPad or something before if I'm practicing a talk, and then you can see how you sound.
Yeah, I think that's a good strategy. So I think people will often find it a little bit disconcerting first time they see themselves give a talk. It's not something you usually get to see, or the first time they hear their own voice. So some of the talks I've given have been recorded and are on YouTube, and I always find it, I can't watch myself actually, but I think that is good advice. It's good to watch that, and then you can think, oh, well, that works quite well. This bit maybe needs a bit of work. So that's helpful, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I've had the opposite experience, because I always thought I was rubbish at public speaking. I've had to do quite a lot of public speaking, and I've come out cringing every single time, to the extent that I went on a public speaking course and I was recorded doing it, and when they played it back, it wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it was in my head. So I'd recommend it, definitely. I don't think that we're ever as bad as we believe sometimes that we are. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. So glad you said that, because that is a very common experience. So, you know, where I teach, we get our students to do lots of presentations over the course of their degree, and they will constantly say, I was so nervous. It must have been so obvious how nervous I was. And you say, no, actually, I had no idea. So one's own perception of how one is coming across can be very different to the reality. Any other thoughts about that? Okay. So, yeah, the main moral there then is practice, practice, practice. It's really important. One of the things that it's useful to do, of course, when you're practicing is to practice with the timing. So sometimes, it's good to just take a small section of the talk, might even just be a single slide, and practice that repeatedly. And that's good when, you only have a small amount of time, and so you can just break things up, do a little bit at a time. But other times it is good if you can try and deliver the entire talk and time yourself and find out how long it takes, because it's really important that you have a sense of that. One of the things you don't want to do, and I speak from bitter experience, is have a talk that goes on for far too long, because it's too difficult for your audience to maintain concentration. And on that note, actually, this is a very long talk. And there are good reasons for that. A lot of people will say a talk shouldn't be longer than, well, actually different people have different ideas about what the ideal length for a talk is, but you'll often hear people say 45 minutes is the ideal kind of time for a standard sort of a talk. And this talk is about twice as long as that. And the reason is that it's trying to convey quite a lot of information, but perhaps a more important reason is that because the emotion is important for the talk and getting people to experience that emotion, that's something that you can't rush. You have to allow people to start to go on that emotional journey and to sit with those emotions and to stew in them for a while. So it's important to give that a bit of time. And that's one of the reasons why I recommend thinking of it as a two-part talk, and at the end of the first part, have a minute's silence, have an opportunity for people to talk to each other, and have a toilet break and get themselves something to drink before coming back to part two, so that they can renew their concentration. And then one of the things I want to say about practice is there are two parts of the talk that I think are particularly important to practice. Well, let me put that to you. Which are the two parts of the talk that you think would be especially important to practice?
Leo?
I guess just the sort of beginning and end, when you're sort of trying to grab their attention in the first part and then leave them with a message, how to carry on.
Right. I'm guessing you're an experienced public speaker, Leo.
A little bit, yeah.
Yes, so the beginning and end, and for exactly the reasons that Leo says, that in the beginning, that's when you want to really capture people's attention, and for your own sake, it's really useful to be able to get off to a good start, particularly if you have any anxiety about public speaking. If you can be really familiar with the first part of your talk, so you just, you can do that bit in your sleep, then that helps to get over some of those initial nerves. You just, you have a nice run-in to the rest of your talk. Your audience may also have a little bit of anxiety at the start of the talk. They want you to do well, and they might be a bit concerned about what's happening. And so it's nice for them if you have a good start to the talk. And first impressions are important. In psychology, we talk about the primacy effect, about how the beginning and the ending are the things that people remember the most. So they will remember that, and it's good for it to go well. And then, of course, the end is important because that's the bit that you're going to leave them with. And it's very easy, if you don't give some thought to this ahead of time, especially given that it's a long talk, to kind of get towards the end and then just trail off a bit at the end. And that's a shame. You've had people go on this emotional journey, and what you want the end of the talk to do is then to provide a kind of a call to action. By part two, you've maybe tried to rouse people, rile them up a bit, and you then want them to leave with a clear idea, yes, this is something I can do. And it's a shame if instead it just kind of trails off. So that's a good bit to make sure that you're really familiar with as well. Okay. But the point of practice is not to be a perfectionist. It's not about being word perfect. And indeed, I don't think you should be thinking about trying to be, trying to memorize what it is you have to say, or trying to present in a way that doesn't involve any hesitation at any point. Actually, I think a bit of hesitation when people are talking is quite a good thing. It adds to that authenticity. It makes it more natural. It'll often be the case that the point at which you hesitate or pause will be the points when you have to think a little bit more about what you're saying. And those are also the times when your audience has to do a little bit more processing to understand your message. So it's often the case that those pauses come at just the right time. And when people, sometimes you go to a talk, often a short talk, and it's very obvious that the speaker has rehearsed this talk to the point at which every single word is going to come out the same way every time. And it can have the effect that they're not putting those pauses in, and it starts to feel a little bit sort of machine-like. And what we don't want to do is train up a bunch of XR robots to go and deliver the talk exactly like this and say it the same way every time. It's important that we have that human element. So don't beat yourself up about being entirely perfect. Don't worry about the occasional and And along similar lines, if when you're giving the talk, at some point you realize, oh, I was going to say this thing and I didn't say that, well, that's fine. Just go on. There will sometimes be a temptation for people to try and wind themselves back and say, oh, and something I meant to say was this. Don't do that. The moment is lost. You'll just confuse your audience if you try and go back. So just forgive yourself, go on. Your audience are not going to know that there was this thing that you were going to say anyway. That's fine. Okay, any more comments before I continue? Okay, so one of the concerns that people will often have about public speaking is they'll say, well, it's easier for some people because they're natural speakers, maybe they're extroverts, they're comfortable with being the center of attention. And they'll say, well, it's not so easy for me because I'm just not a natural speaker. And the thing I want to say about that is that, I think it may be that it is initially harder for quiet people to give talks, but there's no reason why they can't. And, I'm ordinarily quite a quiet, reserved person, but I found that actually it's really great giving talks because, as a quiet person, here's a chance when you can actually get a word in edgeways and people will wait for you to talk. And I suspect that it's often the case that people who are ordinarily quiet are often quite powerful as speakers. People are quite interested in hearing what they have to say, and they're more likely to have given some careful thought to what it is that they're going to say. So if you're one of those people, if you're in that situation where you think, well, I'm not a natural speaker, this is more difficult for me, the message I want to say is that don't worry about that. It really is just a matter of practice, and actually there's a good chance that you will be a really effective speaker because of the fact that you're normally a quiet person. However, it is important that you're not quiet in the sense of nobody being able to hear you. So obviously, try to speak up. Sometimes people are too quiet when they're talking. It is a good idea, if you have any concerns about this, at the start of your talk to do a little volume check, to try to speak to people who are at the back of the room, the space, make sure that they can hear you. if they can't hear you, well, I mean, sometimes you'll be in a situation where if it's a big space, there might be a microphone or something that you can use. Otherwise, it might be a good idea to ask people to come forward if that's possible, so that you don't have some people right at the back and you're really having to push yourself. But otherwise, it's just important to project, to try to concentrate on the idea of speaking to those people at the back rather than the people who are just in front of you. It's a good idea to stand up straight and take deep breaths. You know, there is lots of advice that I'm sure you can find online about vocal delivery. So I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but I just want to encourage people to give some thought to that, because it's a shame if you put a lot of effort into preparing a good talk and then you don't manage to speak loud enough for people to hear it. So again, that often comes down to confidence. And if you are confident about the message that you're delivering, then chances are you will speak up. Sometimes when people are quiet, it's because they're not quite sure. And maybe it's because you have some of these concerns about, you know, am I qualified to give the talk? And hopefully, you know, by the end of this session and by the time you've practiced a couple of times, you will feel qualified, and you'll believe the message. You'll believe that this is important to communicate to people, and that will give you the confidence to speak up. I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to say a couple more things, and then we can have a short break and go on to Citizens Assembly, or have the Citizens Assembly and then have a break, whichever works better for either. So two last things that I want to say, some bits of general advice, is that it's important to try to stay calm. My experience, you know, if you ask other people who've given talks, is that every time you give a talk, something is going to go wrong. That's kind of inevitable. You don't know in advance what it's going to be, but there'll be some kind of problem with the equipment or with the space, or there'll be some background noise. Whatever it is, just try to stay calm, rise above it, and don't let it faze you. And don't let it be a distraction. Sometimes when something goes wrong, that will throw off the speaker, and you know, they end up, you know, making a bit of a song and dance about it, and that can be problematic. You know, you can even get the audience offside, which of course you don't want to do. Certainly, what you don't want to do is, you know, abuse your power. You know, blame someone for something that's gone wrong. You know, someone said they were going to have this mirror stick. You know, don't do that. Just stay calm. It'll be all right. And just accept it. Okay, so this is the thing that has gone wrong this time, and maybe I can learn from that next time, but I'm just going to keep on going and try not to get distracted. And that kind of, well, this relates to what we were talking about before, about the idea of recording yourself and then watching it, and trying to get some ideas about how you can improve. Well, the best way to do that, of course, is to do it after you actually deliver the talk, and think about what things seem to work, what things you know, was I happy about, and which things maybe didn't work so well. And if you think that there are aspects of the talk that didn't go so well, and you know, you feel a bit uncertain about it, despondent, I really want to encourage you to, you know, not to beat yourself up about it. You know, it's always a learning experience, giving a talk, every single time. And so try and treat it as that. Think, okay, well, this bit didn't go as well as I would like, but I can work on that for next time. Likewise, if it seems to you that the talk went really well, don't nevertheless be complacent about it, you know, because chances are there's always something that can be improved. So try to think about, you know, what things maybe went well and you could build on for next time. And it's very useful if you can get feedback from people, particularly if you can communicate your desire for feedback in a way that lets people know that you really do want some constructive feedback. So not like, wasn't that great, but something that makes people feel like they can tell you about things that are useful and that won't then upset you. Try to listen with an open heart and not get defensive. When people tell you about what they thought about your talk, just try and take notes, think about that, think about what you can use later. Now, it may be that by bad luck you happen to ask someone who's hypercritical and isn't very thoughtful about thinking about what they say, the impact it might have on you. And if so, then don't get upset about that. But chances are you will get something useful that you can then use for next time. Because it's important to think about how you can constantly improve what you're doing. Okay, so I think that's pretty much all I want to say about general advice. Maybe if people have any questions or comments about that, we can talk about those, and then perhaps have a break for a couple of minutes before we go on. Maybe there are no questions. People are happy. Is Eva still here?
Yeah, I'm scanning. I'm not seeing anybody looking like they're keen to say anything at this stage.
Great. Okay, good. So, Eva, I know you're going to tell us a bit about citizens' assemblies. Would you like to do that immediately, or should we have a short break before you do that?
Sure, as in what, like a couple of minutes?
Yeah, would that be good?
I'm really happy to do that. I'm guessing I kind of feel a need for a bit of a break. I'm guessing other people maybe feel the same.
Yeah. So, well, I make it 1936 now. So, well, about 5 minutes, around 1941, we'll reconvene.
Okay.
Great.
You too.
Okay, how are we doing?
People are slowly coming back.
You in Edinburgh, Eva?
Yes, I am. Yeah, and I just realised I should pause the recording for the whole big pause. It's going to be a little meditative break for people who are watching it. Because I'm pretty sure you can't edit these things afterwards. Am I sounding crackly to you?
There is some crackling happening. I'm not sure if it's from you or from Eva.
Yeah. There's definitely crackling somewhere.
How's that? Nope, that's still bad.
Could you try muting your? Oh no, he's muted now. Okay, how's that now?
I don't know. How is that now? That's sounding a lot better.
That sounds good. Yeah.
Sounds right to me.
Okay, we're just about all back. Colin.
Yes.
I'm really happy to talk on citizens' assemblies, but I'm not quite sure how to focus what I'm saying. What was your thinking?
Well, I didn't have any particular plans. So I think Emily mentioned. Let's see what she said. Did she?
Yes, she asked me, and she was at a workshop that we did a little while ago. So it may be.
Well, I mean, would it be okay if we asked you a few questions then?
Yeah, I mean, I think it may be partly because we're taking a slightly, we have an additional approach to the Climate Citizens Assembly in Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
So I could talk a little bit about that bit. The plan is to write an extra bit for the talk that people can kind of slot in. And because we're going to be asking people to sign a declaration, which is asking the Scottish Government to have a Climate Citizens Assembly. And that came from conversations that we had in the government with the Scottish Government official got in touch with us quite early on to find out what we were about. And one of the things she said was, you know, if you hadn't approached us before with your demands, then to just start protesting feels like too much. I actually disagree. I think we've been asking the Scottish Government to do more on climate change for a very long time in a whole range of different ways. But it did seem that it would be a good way of letting people show support for that demand without necessarily having to get out on the streets. So it's another way for people to just indicate that they support that demand, that they see the need for climate change to be treated as a special case. Yeah, the other thing that it does is that if the Scottish Government is not receptive and doesn't want to have a citizens' assembly on climate change, then all the people who've signed that declaration then become a kind of constituency of people who we can go back to and say, hey, you said you really cared about this. The government's not going to support us on it. What do you think about a citizen-led citizens' assembly? Which is, you know, it's obviously a second choice as far as we're concerned, because it means that the government's not taking it as seriously as we want, but it still could be a kind of real focus for action and change if it's well enough supported. We have a slightly complex situation unfolding in Scotland at the moment, in that the Scottish government has just said that it's going to have a citizens' assembly on the future of Scotland, which is to do with independence. It's not to do with climate change. And oops. And there's a concern that it might it might muddy the water rather, because they could easily say, oh well, but we'll make ours, you know, about a zero carbon future of Scotland. But it feels a lot more like window dressing than something which actually is saying, look, this is an emergency and this is how we deal with emergencies, is we prioritize taking action on them. So there's you know, we've got into quite an intense political situation, and right this second I'm not feeling really clear on how to tackle that. And you have got a point.
Yeah, so we've trying out a little bit because the week after we got the climate emergency through the Highland Council, we thought, okay, so we don't need a demo, what should we do? So we actually got together and had a little sort of celebration march, and then we actually did a little mini citizens' assembly in Falkland Square. And that actually went pretty well, I think. So we had little groups of people and we had a discussion on housing. So we had a topic. I'm not quite sure because I'm missing the meeting this evening, so I don't know what's going to come out of that. But we did think that maybe Highland Council has said they do have a citizens' assembly already of sorts. They have random people selected from the population who, you know, talk to, and so there is something in existence that they said we could use, but we're still waiting to hear from them how we can use it and whether it's functional as what we want to do. But we did ask them for maybe a room in the council that we could try out citizens' assembly. So I'm not sure what the outcome of that is yet, but
Great.
There are movements afoot.
That's fantastic, and that's really great sort of moves forward that's been happening up in Highlands and Islands, aren't you, area? I think it's really important, and when the talk that I went to, there were a lot of questions on the Citizens' Assembly, and people don't know what they are, and they don't necessarily trust them as a format. One of the things that we've been learning is that Citizens' Assemblies are part of a kind of suite of different ways of doing democracy that are called deliberative democracy. And there's several different formats. And the Citizens' Assembly is in some ways the kind of gold standard. And it's quite important that we're quite precise when we're talking about the actions that we're doing, that we don't use that term unless we're really clear that what we're doing is a Citizens' Assembly. A Citizens' Assembly has to have random selection. It has to be well resourced, so people are very often paid to attend to be participants in the Citizens' Assembly. It needs to be independently facilitated, so it's not people who care about the issue who are doing the facilitation. They need to be at a remove, and it has to have expert witnesses that have been chosen by a group of stakeholders. So again, they're not seen as being biased. And the whole thing, all of those sort of specifications are to do with trying to make it as impartial as possible, so that people can really trust what comes out the other end hasn't been influenced by any kind of vested interest. Now, for us, obviously, that would be, you know, the oil industry is massively powerful and rich and has bought its way into our ordinary politics. So we would be really concerned that, and I'm sure they will have a jolly good go at getting their influence into any citizens' assembly that happen. But equally, we have to agree to be bound by the same standards. So we have to back off the sense that we can run our own citizens' assemblies. We can run people's assemblies, which are much more to do with people sharing their points of view, and they can be facilitated by anybody. And there are other kind of really useful thinking processes, kind of shared thinking processes that we can get involved with one another. But let's not call them citizens' assemblies. Let's keep that as this kind of like as impartial, as kind of protected a space as possible. Because what we're seeing coming out of them is that people do really, really good thinking in citizens' assemblies. You watch videos of people coming out of them and they're transformed, you know, they're saying, I came in feeling one thing and I came out thinking another because of things that people had said to me. So people move their points of view. They change their opinions in a way that's actually pretty unusual. And so they're really important. They're potentially the way forward for politics, you know, in a context where people have lost almost all their faith in politics. So we need to guard them and treat them with a lot of respect, while not feeling that means we can't do anything that's deliberative, because we can. Just don't call them a citizens' assembly. And those are the kind of questions that I think people are likely to be asking is, you know, it's about corruptibility. And it's about, and the other thing they ask is about effectiveness. And that's why it would be so much better to get the government to run a citizens' assembly than for us to do even a very well-run citizen-led one. It's because if the government does it, then there's a much higher chance that people will see it as legitimate and that it will get straight into policy, although it doesn't necessarily happen. That is still a hurdle that needs to be kind of negotiated. But it makes it, you know, it's 2 hops closer into the center of power and decision making. So while I think a citizen-led citizens' assembly is better than nothing, it's definitely, for me, would be a second choice, and so not one that we're promoting up here immediately. It's more like a last resort if we just can't persuade the Scottish government to take it seriously. Are there any questions just now for me? Anne?
So if we do things like I've been describing, it's best to call them a people's assembly.
Yeah, I think so. Or look into deliberative democracy, because it is there's a whole range of, I think, different formats that you can use. But at the moment, nothing that you described to me sounded like a citizens' assembly. What we did when we took over the Parliament briefly at the beginning of the year was we called it a symbolic citizens' assembly. So that's one way you can get around that, is to say it's a bit like a citizens' assembly, but we're not saying that it is. But you need to be really clear about that, because I had someone last night saying that we'd muddied the water by doing that. So obviously it hadn't been really well communicated that we did know that what we were doing wasn't an actual citizens' assembly. So you have to be really clear with your messaging on something like that. Any other questions? Ashley?
I was at a Glasgow meeting recently, and citizens' assemblies were talked about, and there was a guy there that raised the point that if we had a citizens' assembly now, or he said in the near future, then what we'd probably get is people who you know, they want to keep flying, they want to keep driving, they want to keep you know, basically doing what they're doing, So, I mean, what sort of timescale are you thinking of? Because I presume you don't want a citizens' assembly that just turns around and says, "Oh, let's just carry on as we are."
It's always a risk, and I think that's that's the scary thing for us in suggesting this as a way through. But I guess the belief is if people are properly briefed, if people are told the truth by respected expert witnesses on what the cost of not taking action now is. There's cost to taking action. Oh yeah, of course, it's going to impact people's lives in ways that they won't necessarily like. But if that's balanced with an honest and realistic assessment of what the cost of not doing that is, our belief is that people will see how important it is to make those changes. And what we do see in citizens' assemblies is that people aren't used to being given responsibility. They really aren't. And they, if you don't give people responsibility, they tend to act irresponsibly. But you see the transformation in people who are in the citizens' assembly process. They're being given a lot of responsibility and they really step up to it. They take things much more seriously than you would think, and they really, really consider and weigh the evidence. And I have, just through the research that I've done, I've come to feel quite a lot of trust in the process and in the fact that, people are really able to step up and make good decisions through this. So I would hope, it is a risk, and it's a terrifying risk, but it kind of feels like all we've got. I think, Issa, did you have a point? And then Julian, and then Anne? You're still muted. I think I can unmute you if you're having trouble.
Unmuting or muting or okay.
You're there.
No, I don't know. I've never been involved in this, but I wondered if one could maybe compare it a little bit to what happens when people serve on a jury. Because I once sat on a jury in Glasgow, and the judge said to us that as a group of people, with each one with their own unique background and knowledge and information, we were much more able to make a fair and balanced decision about this particular case than perhaps an expert could on their own. And I was wondering if that's what happens when you put people from all walks of life together and you give them all the information and they then have to deliberate and make recommendations.
Did you find that people were taking that responsibility really seriously in the jury?
I was really astonished, and I don't come from a background of this kind of thing, and it was the first experience I had with it, and it was absolutely amazing. I was really astonished.
I've heard that too, and I really do think that right from school, we're not given any responsibility, so why bother?
And
but
of course,
when you get
outcome,
that,
the outcome may not be what I want. I think we all need to stop flying and all that, and that may not all happen. And it may also be that they come to the conclusion that we cannot stop every aspect of climate change, or that things will change more than I would like. But we then, at least we've tried.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Julian, and then Anne.
Yeah, I just want to share something from my own experience, really, that might be relevant for the talk and actually winning people over to the cause of XR, as it were. One of the initial issues I had with non-violent direct action is that it's fundamentally non-democratic. And the way that the demands are set up, I think, is a stroke of genius. So for me, that was a really big thing. Without the Citizens' Assembly really clearly explained, I wouldn't have been able to commit to what I'm doing now. So I don't know whether that's a common experience amongst other people, but it's got a real deep ethical implication for the whole thing for me.
Yeah, that sounds really right. And I echo that feeling too. Anne.
I think I accept what you're saying. I think if we do the talk as widely as possible, then actually you're starting with a different baseline in terms of people's knowledge and sort of taking it seriously. So you probably won't reach everybody with the talk, but hopefully you'll reach enough people to have to sort of raise the base a little bit, so that when you choose your people, they'll be a little bit more more knowledgeable to start with than the average person is now.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And another kind of technique that we've been considering, although Jesus, it's such a lot to do. Robert McAlpine talks about the way that the Bernie Sanders campaign was conducted, and it was really, really grassroots. It was people just talking to their friends and getting a bit of support from the campaign on how to answer different questions that people might have. And if you can set something like that alight, and I think XR has the potential to do that, stuff like doing the talk everywhere, stuff like having conversations. One of the things that I picked up on with the Irish Citizens' Assembly, which is one of the really famous ones because it was followed by a referendum, was that while that Citizens' Assembly was actually happening, hardly anybody in Ireland was aware of it. And it was only really with the referendum that the public awareness happened. And I think if and when we're successful with our Citizens' Assembly, we need to really attend to that. And it may be through, through using our connections as XR to make sure that people know about that they're involved in kind of mini public conversations. I've just seen that Evie asked where I have experienced a true Citizens' Assembly. And then Catherine has a question, and then maybe I should hand back to you, Colin. Evie, I haven't experienced one. I've just done quite a lot of research because I was interested in it, and I've watched quite a lot of videos. So if you go on YouTube and just search, you'll see videos of them happening, and of people getting interviewed during them and when they come out, and it's quite affecting. Just to see how much people step up to that kind of thing. Catherine.
Yeah, I've heard the example of the Irish one before, but what was it actually formed for? What was kind of the banner that it started under?
The Irish citizens, the Irish government has a constitution, and there are things, the constitution can't be changed unless there's a certain kind of voting thing happens. But they wanted to discuss, and they discussed 6 things. So they had 6 different citizens' assemblies. I'm not quite sure how long each one of them was. They tend to take place over weekends. So the one that the Scottish Government's planning is going to be 6 weekends over 6 months, which is big. That's a lot of time that they're asking for people to give. So they were consulting on different bits of the Constitution. And that one, the one on abortion, they decided, I think partly because the Citizens' Assembly had come out so strongly in favour of changing the law, they then decided to have their referendum. But they also did one on climate change. And they came out with some recommendations that were fine. They weren't actually very much stronger than what the Scottish Government's doing. And they put them straight into a committee, which has been sitting with them for a year. So they lack the sense of urgency, and that part of the job XR just has to be like a sheepdog. So first of all, we have to get it on the agenda. Then we have to chase them to actually pick it up. Then we have to chase them to make sure it's going to be effective. So that's making sure that they say that they're going to take it seriously. And then afterwards, we'll probably have to chase them to actually do that because they won't want to. So the whole time we're just like, we'll change our tactics and we'll change our messages. depending on what it is that we get. Oh, thank you. There's a link now in the chat from Julian. And folks, I am going to go because I need to feed my kids. But it's been lovely to see you all, and thank you so much, Colin, for taking the time. And yeah, see you all soon. Lots of love. Bye bye.
Thank you, Eva. That was really great. I really liked hearing about what's happening with citizens' assemblies up in Scotland. And I'd like to echo what Eva was saying about the importance of precision in our language. Just want to check, can everyone hear me? Yep, great. So yeah, it's important to be precise and not to say citizens' assembly when we mean people's assembly. In particular, we don't want to convey the misimpression to people that when we talk about deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies, what we mean is there's going to be a hand-picked bunch of Extinction Rebellion people deciding what everyone should do. I really liked what Julian was saying about, you know, if it wasn't for the idea of a citizens' assembly, then yes, nonviolent direct action could seem profoundly anti-democratic. You know, a very small minority of people causing disruption to try to impose their will on the majority. But the fact that it's actually about trying to introduce deliberative democracy and letting the people have their say allows one to get over that kind of concern. And it's great what Eva was saying about the role of XR as a sheepdog as well. I like that. Just a couple of other things I want to mention briefly about that. So Eva mentioned about different things that you can watch online. There are two things I'd particularly recommend in addition to what she was talking about. There is a wonderful TED talk by a guy called Brett Henning, I think his name is, who is the director of the Sortition Foundation. So it's only about 10 minutes long, but if you haven't watched it, I strongly recommend it. It really sells very powerfully the idea of sortition and a citizens' assembly. And then if you have a little bit longer, there's this great guy, a French guy called Etienne Chouard. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce his surname. It's spelled C-H-O-U-A-R-D. He's a school teacher, I think, but he's someone who's very passionate about the need to get rid of politicians, get rid of elections, and let the people speak. And he's got a TED talk as well, but the video I particularly recommend of him is one where he's just sitting in what looks like a classroom, and he speaks for quite a while, and he goes into some of the history behind this and a bit more of the philosophy. So that's an interesting one. But there are also some videos that you can watch from people who participated in Scotland in citizens' juries there. Very short little snippets of interviews with people who were involved in those citizens' juries, talking about, you know, what a profound experience it was for them to feel like they could actually have some influence and the way in which their views changed. Okay, so I think that's really great if the version of the talk that is delivered in Scotland can say a little bit more about citizens' assemblies. That's a nice example of the way in which the talk can be customized. When I do the talk, you know, I certainly talk about citizens' assemblies and talk about the importance of this third demand. I recommend the TED talk by Brett Henning, but I don't spend a long time talking about citizens' assemblies, but only in the context of, well, politicians have had decades to try and solve this problem and have failed, so let's let the people have a go. So let's talk a little bit more now about the way in which one might customize the talk, and also about, you know, one's own relationship to the talk. I mean, this is something that it's possible to have difficulty with, struggle with when you initially give the talk, to try and think about, you know, how does the talk relate to me and where am I within the talk? And there, I think, you know, it's good to it's good as much as possible to keep yourself separate from the talk. You know, David Ogilvy, the person who's talked about as the the father of brands in marketing, said that a good advertisement is one which sells the product without drawing attention to itself. And the sense in which you want to do that, you don't want to draw too much attention to yourself. You just want to deliver this Extinction Rebellion message. However, having said that, there are some points within the talk when I think it is quite useful for you to bring yourself in and to make it a little bit more individual and perhaps reflect on your own experience. So, where are those points? Well, one point, obviously, is at the very start, the introduction. You need to say who you are, and you can keep that very brief. If you want to, you might want to spend a couple of minutes doing it. Don't make it too long. It might just be a single sentence, but obviously you need to say who you are, and just say that you're a member of Extinction Rebellion. And if you want to say a little bit more about your personal journey, then that's fine, but not too long at the outset. Another point at which you might want to say something a bit more about yourself and bring yourself into the talk is times at which you can maybe talk about some inside knowledge that you might have. And so one example of that is in talking about the idea of arrest. So if you yourself have been arrested, or maybe you haven't been arrested, but you've been in a situation where you might have been arrested, then that's a good thing for you to be able to talk about, because most of your audience, of course, want to have been arrested, or at any rate, they want to have been arrested for participating in climate activism. And they will have great concerns about that. It'll seem like a very radical idea to them. So if you have had that experience, then it's very useful if you can try to allay people's concerns somewhat. So, I've been arrested a couple of times, and I like to show a couple of photos of the different occasions I've been arrested, and I show a photo of a police cell. I mean, not the particular cell I was in, but one that looks very much like it. And then, I can talk about that experience and how, for me at any rate, it was fine. I like to say to people that being in a police cell for me was a lot like being in my office, where I am right now, except with no email. So it was quite liberating. And, in that way, you can try to get people a little bit more on board with the idea and think, okay, maybe this isn't such a radical idea. Another thing I like to say to people sometimes is that, in my view, after many years of writing letters and signing petitions and so on, getting arrested is a bit like signing a petition, but underlining it and writing it in bold or maybe in red. It's just a way of really magnifying the extent to which you are expressing your belief in a position. It's not necessarily the radical idea that it can seem to be, particularly if you're going into it expecting to be arrested. Anyway, if you've not been arrested yourself, don't worry. And I'm not suggesting that you have to have been arrested in order to give the talk, but that's an example of the way in which you might have some experience that you can then use to inform your audience. When Emily emailed me, she actually suggested that people might want to talk a little bit more about the idea of being arrested and what people should say about that there were some concerns about that, and that there might be a particular position that people in Edinburgh and elsewhere in Scotland might want to take. So if anyone has any comments about that they'd like to make now, then perhaps we can talk a bit about it. Sorry, I can't actually see everyone at the moment. So I wonder if, would somebody be able to take over from Eva's role and be our facilitator? That'd be quite helpful for me if someone could do that. If you're willing to do that, then just unmute yourself and say.
I'm willing to facilitate.
Great, thank you very much, Lucas.
Yeah, cool. So, Catherine.
About getting arrested, something that I've heard mentioned was that the experience of being arrested can be very different depending on who you are. And so be really wary of saying, when I got arrested, it was fine, and it was the police treated me like this, and that's how they'll then and therefore that's how they will treat you. And you know, in this country, we're quite lucky that generally the police stick to their own laws, but not to downplay the factors that race and gender and sexuality and all other kinds of privileges play in interactions with the police. And so not to be too kind of prescriptive, I suppose, about how your experience was, and to make it very clear that this is how it happened to me, but you have to make your own judgments and you're in control of your own decisions and everything, and it might be different for you, and yeah, that it's not kind of like this was my experience and therefore it will be your experience too.
Does anyone else want to comment on that before I respond to Catherine's point? Okay.
Anne, so Anne, was that you want to respond to Catherine, or you want to ask another question?
Or another question.
Okay, Colin, do you want to respond to that?
Okay, thanks. So I think it's a really good point that you can only talk about your own experience, and you definitely don't want to give the impression that everyone will have exactly the same experience as me. So yes, that's a really good point. The flip side of this argument about how possibly the experience may be different for someone who's not, you know, say white and middle-aged and kind of middle class like me, is that if you are like that, then you ought to be exploiting your privilege. I think people like me have a greater responsibility to take advantage of that and try to bring about change. So that's one thing which I think is quite reasonable to say. And one other point that I would make, and this isn't necessarily something I think you need to say in the talk, but I offer it just as something to think about. And that is, I don't think we should be too simplistic about making this argument about how things might differ along race lines and other relevant dimensions. I mean, I've heard that many times, but then I've also spoken to people of color who've been arrested, and their experience has been similar to mine. And, you know, I think it's really important to think about this in a contextual way. There's something very different about, you know, a couple of young black guys walking along the street at night and then, you know, some police with no reason at all come and stop and search them, from being in a situation where you're in the middle of Oxford Circus, say, and hundreds of people are getting arrested, and you're just sitting down and you're part of this non-violent, peaceful protest. You know, that's a different context. And, you know, I don't think it is appropriate to say, well, therefore your experience will be completely different because you're black, for instance. So it's good to be a little bit more sophisticated than that. And the other thing, you know, along those lines is I like to talk very much with and talk about historical examples. I love to talk about Martin Luther King and the Freedom Riders and so on. And, you know, they couldn't rely on the idea that the police were going to be nice to them, quite the opposite. And that was what made it more powerful. So, yes, don't suggest to people your experience will definitely be like mine, but nor should you say to someone, well, in my view, you shouldn't say to someone, because there might be a difference for you, therefore you definitely shouldn't do this. I think it's up to people to decide, but to go into it feeling like they have at least an awareness of what their experience might be. Any other thoughts about arrest before we go on?
Yeah. I think in Highland we've not actually had any. We've not been successful at finding any legal representation, so we've been rather hesitant about doing anything that could lead to arrest. Although we've had quite a few activists who've gone to Edinburgh and London who have been arrested, so we've we have had personal experience in the group. I think we've actually got a long way without resorting to we've had a lot. We've been outside the townhouse week after week, which has been quite powerful. We've had a petition signed by hundreds of people. We did a sort of a march along the high street, and then we all lay down in Falcon Square, did a die-in, and I think that got good coverage in the press. So, actually, for a group that hasn't been, able to do anything that's been arrestable, we've actually managed to achieve quite a lot. And I think there are things that you can achieve without going to the sort of extent that other groups have gone. Obviously, if we can go, we can find that do that, then there will be other targets that we're thinking of, which will be possibly more tricky than Highland Council, who we thought were going to be tricky, and actually they did come on board. So yeah.
Yeah. So I'll go to Leo and then Ashley.
I just responding to sort of being arrested and how it affects your position. I think I went and chatted to my employer after I'd been arrested in London, and they were really friendly about it and really accepting, and they said, well done. And then later they were saying, oh, quite a lot of people that get arrested. He had a sister who was a bit of an activist, and they said quite a lot of people are retired and they've got nothing to lose. So it's interesting that you chose to, and it sort of opens up that conversation of, I have got something to lose, but as a weighing it up, this is more of a thing, and it might affect my career, but it's more important than that.
Yeah. So Ashley.
I went to the Edinburgh North Bridge blockade, and there were quite a lot of people there. There was a good talk beforehand about the support you'd get if you were arrested, and that was very good. In a small sort of town on the west coast of Scotland, if we were to get a similar sort of percentage of people turning up, there wouldn't be that many of us, so the police could arrest us all fairly quickly, and it would be over and done with, and there'd be very little support. Is there kind of off-site support that if people did get arrested, that XR could provide?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the response from Central XR is that local groups should take responsibility for arrests that are happening within their own area, but certainly people who can provide guidance on that. There are documents about arrestee support and what wellbeing coordinators should do and so on. I wouldn't say that it's a futile thing if it's only a very small number of people who get arrested, because that still makes the paper. The first time I was arrested was in Bristol, and on that occasion there were 8 of us who were arrested, and the papers found out about it, local papers, and they were quite interested that someone like me, a middle-aged science professor, gets himself arrested. That they thought there was a story in that, and that meant that I had the opportunity to write an article for the local paper and explain why I was doing what I was doing, and I got a lot of feedback from that. And it felt like it was really a really useful kind of outreach exercise. So I don't think people should feel like, well, we have to be able to cause major disruption and do something like what happened in London in April in order for this to have any power. As Leo was saying, people seeing some kind of sacrifice, particularly from unexpected quarters, is quite powerful. But yes, if you want to do that, then it's good if you have someone who is in the role of arrestee support, someone who's there ready to meet people when they get out of the police cell, with some nice food and drinks and hugs and so on. And there is some advice that I think you'll be able to get from Simple XR. And if you can't find that, feel free to drop me an email and I can try and source that for you. At the same time, I don't want to suggest that people have to get arrested in order to feel they're doing anything useful. That's not the message. But that is part of the theory of change of XR. Looks like, well.
Yeah. Evie, is that a question from you? Your microphone's not on.
I'm wondering if is it working now? I've got a different computer.
It is, yeah.
The guy, I was at the same meeting last night as Bill. I think we are an XR group, but that's in my head. But the guy from Cornwall who was talking to us, like what happened in London was amazing. It changed everything, and it put the whole thing about climate change way up the agenda. It's big now. So when you get in, when you're living in a rural area, they discovered that they were going to go and do demos at the council. And then they said, well, why don't we just ask them? And when they asked the council if they could declare a climate emergency, they were like, great, we're so glad you've asked. Nobody's ever asked. Nobody's ever written. And they're just working, and so much is happening, and it's expanding, and it's incredible. And I feel the same. I live in rural Galloway. Well, we could go and blockade some road in Kirkcudbright, but it's not going to do any good except annoy people. But we can get in touch with the council. There was a guy from the council at the meeting. They're just waiting for folk to say, you know, declare a climate emergency and get all the ideas that you've got through and start doing them. So it made me think there's an amazing chance for a grassroots thing. I'm really happy to get arrested in London, maybe Edinburgh, but there's no point if you're living out in the sticks. Well, there might be a point, but there's a lot of other things you can do. You can hear me, that's so nice. I really talk too much, goodbye.
Yes, thanks, Evie. We could hear you really well that time. You've got a good line. And that's a really nice point. And yes, of course, we should ask nicely first before we start disrupting things and annoying people. I liked what Eva said before, that you know, XR maybe has this role of being a sheepdog. So maybe a good model is first you ask nicely, and then, yeah, hopefully the council says, yes, we will declare a climate emergency and we will pledge to be carbon neutral by 2030 or so on. And then if your experience is anything like it's been in Bristol, you'll then say 6 months later, so what exactly are you doing? And you discover they're not doing anything. And so then at that point you say, okay, come on, you've got to be serious about this. It's, you know, words are one thing, but how about some actions? And then that's a point when you can sort of try to escalate a little bit if you want to with the idea of being arrested. Okay.
I don't see any more hands up, so I'll pass back to you, Colin.
Thanks, Lucas. Okay, so I said earlier that I thought there were maybe 3 places where you could potentially bring yourself into it. Those were examples. One with the introduction, one where if you feel like you have some inside knowledge, and arrest is one example, but it may be that, you know, if you're an ecologist, for instance, then you can talk knowledgeably about some aspect of the ecological crisis. And anything you do like that is brilliant. But then the third respect in which I think it's useful and perhaps really important to bring yourself into the talk is by modeling a personal response to the information that you're delivering. Simply because I think emotion is so important here. So I'm a psychologist, and so I'm interested in the way the talk works in terms of this approach of trying to influence people and make them go on a particular emotional journey. And it's not a simple thing, you know. It's not that there are a few simple buttons that you can press. Like here's the fear button, you press that, and then that will have some response. People obviously are much more complex than that, and there are big individual differences. But And I think it's really important that you try to get people to have some kind of emotional response to the material. And the talk will tend to do that by itself, but it'll be more powerful if the audience feels that you are somehow modeling that response that you would like them to have. Let me say a little bit more about the emotional trajectory of the talk, and then I can say more about where you might be able to put your response into it. So presumably, you know, when people come along to the talk initially, they're at some kind of baseline level for them. And what you should expect to happen is that over the course of the talk, their mood, if you like, if you think about a single dimension, is going to go down and progressively down and continue to go down. And maybe by the end of part one, they'll really perhaps be feeling in quite, you know, if, to the extent that they have allowed themselves to, they could feel quite sad, anxious, possibly they might be a little bit angry, all sorts of these emotional responses which we would ordinarily classify as negative. In part two, though, you want to use that emotional response to then motivate people to say, okay, I need to act. You want this to be something that mobilizes people. In fact, something that I often like to do at the end of part one, or maybe at the beginning of part two, is to ask people to put up their hands. I'll say, who's feeling sad? People put their hands. Who's feeling angry? And so on. You have a few questions like that to try and gauge people's response. But then I'll ask, and who's feeling like they would like to do something about this? And then what you'll tend to see is that almost all of the hands in the audience go up. So, you know, this conventional idea that when you make people feel fear or anger or sadness, that it just demotivates them and demobilizes them, it's not true. Actually, at least for the kinds of people who will come along to this talk, that will put them in a state where their sensibility is sufficiently affronted that they think, I'm not having this. We've got to do something about this. And then that's the point at which you can deliver part two. And here, you don't want to stay flat. You want to actually go back up so that by the end of the talk, you're revving people up so that by the time they get to the end, hopefully they're in a really positive frame of mind, more positive than when they came in. And hopefully you can be modeling that as you go through the talk. The initial point at which you might start to feel the mood go down in part one, at least, you know, it will depend on the particular version of the talk you give, the slides you use, but I like to include a slide which has the fundamental premise of the talk, which for me is tell the truth and act as if the truth is real. And I explain to people then why I think that's a radical thing and why it is that telling the truth might make them uncomfortable and might make them feel some quite strong emotions. And I urge them to allow themselves to feel those emotions and just to sit with them. And when you do that, you can feel the mood start to go down. When people realize, oh, okay, this isn't perhaps just going to be a normal kind of science talk. This is actually going to be something that's going to make me feel something. And the mood gets slightly tenser, a little bit more serious. And I encourage you to try to, you know, as you're giving the talk, try to tap into the atmosphere in the room. That's a really useful form of feedback. It's one of the things that makes doing this, talking online, so difficult, because I feel like I'm just a disembodied voice in the room. But when you're in a room with people and you have their attention and you know you get these subtle signals from people about how they feel, the expressions on their face and so on. You'll find that the mood will go down as you talk more about severe weather events and all of the terrible consequences of climate change and ecological crisis and so on. One point at which I like to try to bring myself in a little bit in order to model an emotional response is in talking about the extinction crisis. So, you don't need to do this, but I find it quite powerful. So, everyone has their own favorite animal or perhaps a particular species that they might feel particularly sad about when thinking about the extinction crisis. The first time I saw the talk, as I mentioned earlier, was the version that Gail Bradbrook does, and you can see that one. I presume you can still see it if you go to the rebellion.earth website. And in that one, she talks about puffins, and I found it quite affecting when she was doing that. And when I was preparing to give the talk, I thought about that again, thought, well, why did I find that so affecting? And I thought, well, okay, partly it's a sad, but okay, why is it sad? Partly it's because I could see that it was having an impact on her. I think if you watch it, it might even look as if, she might be on the verge of crying. You can tell that she's deeply affected by talking about it, and that's powerful to the audience. But it seemed to me maybe it was more than that. I thought that actually part of it was that I could relate to it myself. I felt like this was just terrible, the idea that there might be the risk of puffins going extinct. And so I thought more about that, why that was. And that led me to make a couple of changes to the way in which I presented that information. I used a similar slide to her. Oh, incidentally, if in the chat, you'll see that, I see we've got some more comments in the chat. Okay, good. I'll have a look at that in a moment. If you look up here a little bit, then you'll see a link to the Google Slides that I've been using most recently in giving the talk. You don't have to, but if you want to open those, then slide, where are we? Yeah, slide 21. I have an image of puffins from The Guardian with the headline, "A World Without Puffins." And partly, I think just this photo almost makes me want to cry. There's something quite affecting about it. But the other thing I added in the upper right corner, this little puffin badge. I put it there not so much for the audience, but for me, but to remind myself about my emotional response. Because in thinking about why was it that I had this connection with puffins? I've never seen a puffin in real life. It was that I thought, okay, well, I have known puffins all my life in the sense that, I was an avid reader when I was a child, and I was a member of the Puffin Book Club. And one time I had a story published in Puffin Book Club magazine, and they sent me a little badge and the Puffin yearbook. And so I used to see these pictures of puffins all the time. I lived in Australia at that time where there are no puffins, but I imagined that I would be able to come back to England at some point and puffins would be abundant. I'd see them everywhere. And so, I tried to reflect on that a little bit in the talk and try to convey to the audience a little bit about my own sadness in thinking about an innocent child having these thoughts about animals which maybe are not going to exist throughout their lifetime. And then I comment on that, thinking about my own children and how, they might end up seeing pictures of puffins in the same way that we now look at pictures of dodos, or see pictures of tigers in the same way that we might look at a picture of a Tasmanian tiger. And so, I'm doing that because that's a genuine response to me. And when I do it, I'm not trying to do this so much now for you, but when I do that in the talk, I do feel an emotional response. and the audience connects with that. And that's what I want to happen. So, you know, you don't have to do that, and you may feel like to do that is to expose a bit of yourself. But if you're game to do that, I would encourage you to think about it, give it a go. Think about something that really upsets you about whether it's the climate emergency or the ecological emergency, and see if you can use that as a way to then connect with your audience and model a response. Does anyone have any thoughts or comments about that?
Caitlin?
Thanks, Leo. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to, I was at the Climate Change Consciousness Conference, and it was just about this whole thing about emotional, and the whole week there was an emotional roller coaster. For anyone who live streamed in, you'll know what I'm talking about. And we had home groups to deal with those emotions because they were so powerful. I mean, you know, hearing firsthand from Indigenous peoples, from elders, from people who are right at the front end of this. And in our home group, there was a big, burly, strapping marine scientist. He's been working with the smallest species of dolphin for the last 30 years, trying to save it. And he just burst into tears. And the response, the emotional response to just feeling his absolute desolation and distress because he watched the last one die. And I mean, that's now what, 6 weeks ago. So I really, I mean, I came away from that conference, and I've worked in this field for years. And I came away from that conference so motivated to act. You know, it was just the day job for me. And now it's become, you know, my life. And it was exactly what you're saying, Colin. It was that emotional response to hearing it firsthand from people experiencing this and what people are experiencing. We all have our own stories. So, yeah. Just wanted to share that, and I do actually have, and Fintorn are working very hard to share the keynote addresses, which included Vandana Shiva, it was Jonathan Porritt, Christina Ogler that made the Paris Agreement happen, but also I think more potently probably the indigenous elders, you know, from the Amazon basin. We know what's happening there. And if anybody wants, I've got a personal link to those talks at the moment. If anybody wants access to those, I can share that with you. They are trying, we're all trying very hard to raise the funds to make them more widely available, so I can keep you posted on that too. But very, very, very powerful. So thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Caitlin. That sounds amazing. That sounds amazing. If you think it would be appropriate, then yeah, if you could post a link in the chat, that'd be wonderful. I mean, only if you think that's okay to do, but I would certainly like to see some of those things that you're talking about. And as you say, it is about people telling their own story, and it's extraordinarily powerful when you see other people being affected by it, and it's powerful in a way that motivates you, as you say, to act. And I find, you know, a danger with having done the talk repeatedly is that you can, you know, it becomes kind of secondhand, and you know, there's a risk that it loses some of its edge. And so, for me, seeing other people have that emotional response is very helpful in reminding me. But also, it reminds me that when I'm doing the talk, that I have to actually, you know, I want to inhabit it and not just deliver it in a way that's too rote. I don't think there's too much danger of that. It's hard to do the talk in a way that doesn't end up producing some kind of emotional response in you. Okay, so that's something that brings the mood down a bit more. And I find it hits rock bottom for me when I get to what is slide 31 in the slides that I sent the link to. which is this quote from Kate Marvel, where she talks about how, because she's a climate scientist, you know, she gets asked to do talks, and the organizers always ask her to talk about hope. They say climate change is bleak. Tell us a happy story. Give us hope. And the problem is, she says, I don't have any. And you know, at that point, it's like you feel the oxygen sucked out of the room, and people think, oh shit, what have we done? How have we got here? And at that point, you know, it can make you feel a bit uncomfortable, because you'll look around the room, and if things have gone the way you planned, you will see that people are affected. You know, there'll be people looking really sad. You know, on several occasions, I've had people in tears, with people putting their arms around them, and that's going to make you feel bad, right? Because you're the one who's made them feel like that. And, you know, normally that's a bad sign in a talk. You know, I know if I'm giving a lecture and people start crying, that's usually a bad sign. But in this talk, that is actually the kind of response I want to elicit. And so then you'll feel guilty about that, because there'll be a part of you saying, yes, I've created this response. But that's one of the things about doing this talk. If you want to deliver it in this way, and you really want to make use of emotion, then I wouldn't. I mean, there's a danger that you might then feel like, well, I'm being manipulative. And my response to that is, like, I don't think this is about manipulating people. I think it's actually helping people to allow them to use their emotions as a kind of feedback. You know, as a psychologist, I'm interested in questions like, why do we have emotions at all? And it might seem a bit reductionist, but I think it's because they provide a kind of a feedback mechanism for us. You know, if I see something that makes me angry, then I update my model of the world, and it tells me there is something wrong with the world, or there's something that I need to do to reduce that response and bring things back into line. And too often, we engage as a society and as individuals in kind of denial, and we erect this screen that allows us to stop experiencing the world. But if we're going to do anything about this problem, we need to get over that. We need to experience these emotions and go on this journey and go through a kind of a grieving process. So if you feel like, oh, I can't do that, it makes me too uncomfortable, the idea of putting people through that, then part of me wants to say, well, maybe you shouldn't do this talk. Maybe you can do it in a different way, in a more restrained way. But in a sense, that would be losing some of the power of it. So that's something to think about. It's one of the things that makes the talk very challenging to deliver in some ways, but also it's something that makes it quite rewarding, because you feel like, and you get the response from people afterwards. You know, they'll come up to you and say, thank you. You know, thank you for telling the truth. Thank you for actually talking about this problem in a way that's real. So that's something I urge people to think about when thinking about what it's going to be like to give the talk, and just be aware of that emotional impact. I think it's really important at the end of part one, you know, if you follow this kind of model I'm suggesting, and you end part one with that quote from Kate Marvel, well, irrespective of how you end it, but you get to this point where you're at the end of part one, and hopefully now people realize, oh yeah, this is serious. We've got a real problem, and they feel very sad about the situation that we're in and all the species that we've already made extinct and so on. It's good at that point to have a minute of silence. I think that's really important, to then allow people to sit with those emotions, if you like, to stew in them for a bit. We don't want them to get immediately distracted by other thoughts. I want people to think about this and have a little moment just to reflect on it and think about how it relates to them and what their response to that should be. So it can seem like a very unusual thing to do. I mean, I'm sure for some of you, that's quite a normal thing to have a minute's silence. But certainly the first time I gave the talk, I was thinking, well, am I going to do that? Because I'm used to giving science talks, right? And the idea that you would have a minute's silence in the talk, it's just like, what's that about? But I did it, I was worried, well, maybe people won't be silent. So, maybe they'll be checking their phones or whatever. But actually, people tend to be pretty compliant if you ask them to do it as an audience. And I think it's very powerful. It's a really key ingredient of the talk. And if you're game, I'd suggest also having a minute of silence at the end of the talk as well, before you go on and have any questions. And at the end of that minute of silence after part one, that's a good chance then to have people turn to their neighbor, have a conversation with each other. Those conversations, I think, are going to be really important. And then also they can have a little break, because there will have been a long time when you've been speaking, and so it's good for them to have a little rest from that. Something else that I like to do to help break up the time, so it's not just me talking all the time, is to include 1 or 2 readings where I get someone else to come in and speak for a short time. And so one of those that I do, if you're able to look at these slides, then where are we? In this version, it's on page 17. If you can't see that, I'll explain. This is part of the talk where I talk about the impact of extreme weather events, because up to then, I've been talking about, one of the consequences of global heating is that there will be lots of climate refugees, there will be more extreme weather events, that, there could be as many as 1 billion climate refugees, according to some estimates, by the year 2050, 1 in 9 of the world's population at that point. But there's no way that we can really make sense of those figures. They kind of go beyond human comprehension. So I think it's really important to try to bring it down to a level that people can relate to, so that they can think about the human side of it, the human cost, the personal tragedies. And so this is a story that comes from a book called Voices of Nagas Survivors. Cyclone Nagas was a cyclone in Myanmar that happened in around about 10 or 11 years ago, I think. And this book has lots of stories like this about, survivor accounts. And this particular account is particularly wrenching because it describes a woman whose husband and 2 children were lost. They went out on their boat and the cyclone came in and she was the only one who survived it. And I try to have someone read this passage who I think will be able to give it the kind of gravity and emotional resonance that it requires. And sometimes when they're doing that, they might actually shed a tear themselves because it's very affecting. And again, that's something that part of me thinks, oh, it's not very nice making people feel these strong emotions. But a bigger part of me thinks, well, actually, that's exactly what we need. We need to recognize that this is what climate breakdown means. This is the human cost. It's stories like this, tragedies like this that are being repeated again and again all around the world, and not just in the future, right now. So, you don't need to include readings, but I think it's something to consider, and I can send you a link to some of the readings that I've used if you're interested in doing that. I'm going to pause for a second to see if anyone has any more questions or comments.
Anne, would you like to speak?
Yeah, we've just had a talk last week or so from one of the people who was trained in the previous round of talk training, is a junior doctor. My husband's a consultant, and so they did a double act. So he introduced and talked a little bit, and then she gave the XR talk, and then he did a conclusion as well. But I think, so they just invited doctors to it. And I think that was actually quite effective, that it was doctors talking to doctors. So there's sort of like the idea of peers talking to peers. And I wonder if there's the scope for doing that, you know, that actually people are maybe more receptive when they hear it from their peers rather than somebody else. So.
Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the big motivations also, of course, for trying to train up lots of people to deliver the talk, because then those people will be able to talk to their specific communities in a way that's much more powerful than others. So, you know, you might have some experienced speaker who can do a good talk, but that person won't necessarily be the most effective communicator for any given audience. And so, yes, absolutely, it's very good if you can think about, you know, when you're thinking about preparing the talk, have in mind the audience that you want to speak to, and think about where you want to go, and think about, yeah, how might I tailor the message slightly for this audience? Yeah. So, you know, I've been talking a little bit about some of these attempts to really make people take this seriously and emphasize the emotion in the talk. For that reason, I want to say something briefly about children. And I say this partly so that people can learn from my mistakes. So the first time I gave the talk, I noticed at the outset that there were a couple of children in the audience. And so I went to speak to their mum, who was with them, and you know, I told her a little bit about some of the content of the talk, what to expect, and she was fine with that. She said, you know, we're very open. We talk about death with our kids, and you know, we want them to experience this. And one of them was actually quite young, so you know, wasn't really going to take it all in anyway. And the other one I spoke to in the break, and he was talking with his mum, and he seemed okay. And so I was happy. I thought, yes, this is her responsibility, and it's up to her. The second time I gave the talk, it was in a it was in a converted church, and I didn't spot that behind a pillar there was this. I guess he was 10 or 11 years old, and at the end of part one, he came out with his mother, and they were about to leave, and she said, "Oh, sorry, we're going to go now." And he was clearly quite distraught. And, you know, this was the worst possible outcome as far as I was concerned, because not only had I upset him, but he didn't get to see part two, which is the bit where, you know, you say, actually, as adults have a plan. We are trying to do something about this. So I felt really bad about that. And, you know, it turned out that the organizers were able to make contact with her, and she was able to watch with him the second part of the talk subsequently. And, you know, I think it was okay. But that's something that I urge you to think about. And I like to say, when the talk is being advertised now, that it's not a child-friendly talk. Again, you know, if parents come along with their children, then I think it's up to them to decide. But as long as they're doing that in a way that is informed, then that's fine. And someone, I think it was you, Anne, who raised the point about, yeah, what about a talk aimed directly at children? Yes, in fact, we should have such a talk, but the kind of talk that I'm talking about isn't that talk. I mean, it's problematic.
We do have quite a lot of the young people sort of coming to demos and things, and you know, they've just organised a big march and things, and it would be nice to be able to have something to offer them, really. So if there can be something that's sort of tailored for, because it's not really appropriate for, you know, to say to children, oh well, you know, you can get arrested and all the rest of it. So I think it's trying to sort of, what do they need to know, and how can you still give them some sort of action to do. It's not the sort of go and get arrested thing.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I mean, both parts of the talk are potentially problematic for children. Both, you know, if you're really making the first part emotional, and you know that might not be appropriate for children. But also, yes, the second part, the idea about getting arrested, you have to be very careful there because you don't want to get accused of inciting children to break the law. I think there are people working on that, and it's certainly important that we have something we can deliver to children. Although, from experience, I can tell you that schools at this point are not necessarily terribly open to the idea of members of Extinction Rebellion going in and delivering talks there. But well, we'll work on that.
Yeah, no, just on that note, in Edinburgh, actually, schools have asked members of Extinction Rebellion to come in, and there are people working at the moment on adapting this talk to give on the 10th and 13th of June, if anyone's interested in getting involved with that. I'll come to Catherine, who has a question for you as well. We can't hear you, Catherine. Can you turn your mic?
Yep, sorry. I'm the talk that we're going to give to schools. We're going to have a meeting this Sunday, the 2nd, to like tailor the workshop and sort of see how we're going to change it and what we're going to say to them and so on. And I'll be there on the 13th doing that workshop, and that's partly why I'm doing this training now, is to be more equipped for that. But yeah, come along to the meeting. There's not a location yet, but it's in the evening on the 2nd.
That's great. Well, I would be really keen to see the slides if you'd be willing to share them. You know, that's something that we'd like to be doing down here as well, trying to go into schools and have an appropriately tailored talk. It's great. Well, I hope it goes well.
Is there some way we can get a copy of that?
We haven't actually had the meeting yet, so we don't know what we're going to say to them yet. That's what
when
we're going
it's
to decide on.
finalised, is there some way of sharing it with us?
I don't know. I'll mention it at the meeting that other people would be interested in what we decide to use as resources. I'll bring that up, but yeah.
I mean, if you could sort of email it to sort of XR Highlands or whatever.
Yeah. I'll mention it at the meeting and make sure that it is available somehow.
Yeah.
So I'm just looking at the chat, and I'm seeing Julian has raised an important technical point that it's 9 o'clock, in fact it's 9:05 now, and wondering when we want to finish. I'm sorry, we're taking a little bit longer than usual. I mean, this is usually a 3-hour session, but we had a slight delay in starting, and of course we had this assembly stuff. I think probably I would like if we could spend another, well, I'd like to say 15 minutes. Could I get some feedback from people on, or maybe give it to Lucas, feedback on what people think about that? Let's see, Catherine is happy with that.
Yeah. Does anyone just put your hand up if you have? So Julian, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just could say I'm going to have to go, but obviously don't want to stop the proceedings. It's been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. It's really helpful. And just one quick request. I've got the link to the slides there. I've been able to follow that, no problem. Is there also a sort of Word document? Because I've seen other slide presentations with a Word document that's got a kind of crib sheet sort of that goes with it. Is there something that goes with this set of slides as well?
Yes. So do send me an email. I sent the email address before, but maybe I should post that again because I think some people logged on afterwards. But I'll post my email address And then if you email me, I'll send everyone a link to the official slides. So what I've just shared with you here are the slides I'm using at the moment. But the official slides have, in the notes section, the script that goes along with it. So that'd be quite useful. And also that will then allow me to add you to this, this spreadsheet that's used centrally. So thanks very much for coming along, Gillian, and good luck with giving the talk.
Thanks so much. Bye everyone for now. Bye-bye.
So is everybody else okay to go on for another 15 minutes-ish? Just like put your hand up if that's not something that you can do. Is that Ilette?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to go also. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for all amazing advice. It helps a lot. I have actually 1,000 questions that would not fit in 15 minutes anyway. So I think I will digest that and yeah, try to think also with my colleagues here in Sweden. But thank you for everything.
And please do send me your questions.
Yeah. Oh, okay. But how do I get your email?
Let me put it in here again. Can you see the chat?
Yeah.
So it's talksandtraining.xrbristol@protonmail.com. Have I posted that?
I don't see it.
For some reason my I can see it on mine, but it doesn't seem to have posted. Why is
It's
that?
up, it is on earlier in the chat.
Yeah, if you scroll up, then it's there a bit earlier. I don't know why I'm not able to send it now. Oh, I'm only sending it to Julian. Right. Okay. Sorry about that.
Catherine's posted.
There we go. Yes, so that applies to everyone, of course. Do please send me any questions you have, and maybe I'll see if I can think of a way of making an FAQ document that I can send to everyone.
I'm still trying to find the address on the chat. Actually, I don't find it.
You scroll down or up. You do click on the sidebar and scroll.
I just reposted it, so it should be the most recent message.
Ah, yeah. Thank you. I do have it now.
Great.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming.
Bye.
Okay. So I'm going to proceed and try and get through this in 15 minutes or so. So I'm just talking about kids, and you may want to think about whether or not you have children attending the talk, but I do think you should incorporate children into the talk. I think they're very powerful. One of the most powerful ways to influence adults is to allow them to see when children are making sacrifices or standing up and demanding to be heard. And so there's various ways in which you can do that. Obviously, it's great to talk about Greta Thunberg and the school strikes. And Greta, of course, is a very powerful figure in the sense both that, there's this great photo of her sitting alone in front of the Swedish Parliament, and she looks quite vulnerable, and that, certainly for a parent like me, that's something that has this sort of instinctive response that you want to protect someone who looks like that. At the same time, you can then give examples of her speaking truth to power and really letting world leaders have it, which is very powerful. And another example that I like to talk about is the Children's Crusade, which hopefully people will be aware of. So in the civil rights conflict, civil rights process in the 1960s, it was when Martin Luther King was in jail in Alabama, in Birmingham, Alabama, and the kids took it upon themselves to leave school, and filled the streets, and they all got arrested, you know, hundreds and hundreds of arrests in a single day, filled the jails, and then more came back the next day. And the guy who was in charge there, Bull Connor, was a real thug, and so ultimately said, right, let him have it. And so there are these photos of children being hosed with these, you know, high pressure water hoses, of police dogs being used to attack children. And it was when those photos were on the front pages of newspapers in America that Middle America said, what the hell is going on? You know, this should not be happening in the land of the free. And almost immediately after that, John F. Kennedy was forced to come out on television and say, you know, we won't be having this anymore, and I will sign into law a Civil Rights Act which will end segregation. And that, of course, wasn't the end of that journey, but it was a really important milestone, and that was achieved by children. And so that's nice, both as an example of how nonviolent direct action really can work, but it also illustrates this idea of sacrifice, the power of sacrifice, especially from people who are vulnerable, but also this idea about backfiring that I think is really important to emphasize, and one that I think will be important in giving this talk in the lead up to the Autumn Rebellion as well. I'm sure everyone will have heard about, you know, Cressida Dick and other politicians talking about how they're going to be much tougher this time, and maybe about how they're going to charge all the people who are arrested in April. And, you know, a fundamental misunderstanding there is the idea that that would be problematic for people in Extinction Rebellion. Actually, everyone I speak to says, yeah, bring it on. That's exactly what we want, because it is that kind of backfiring effect that we're looking for. You know, when people see that 83-year-old people are being sent to prison for sitting on a train carriage because they want to try and wake people up and make the world a better place, then they're going to say something is not right here. So it's nice to be able to illustrate that, both with children and with older people, you know, both ends of the age spectrum. And that, you know, that hints about how one thing that's really important in part 2 is that you should be telling a success story. And this is much easier now, I think, post-April than it was before the International Rebellion. So what I liked to do previously was to talk about, the particular example I liked was talking about Roger Hallam and the campaign to divest at King's College. And, you know, there's a nice sort of very cheeky story there about him being a PhD student at King's College London and chalk spraying their buildings and getting thrown out, and then that backfiring, and so he gets let back in, and then he went on hunger strike, and so they kicked him out again, and people said, you can't do that, and so they let him back in. And pretty soon, you know, in the space of, I think it was around 7 or 8 weeks, they had won that campaign and King's College agreed to divest. When this is a process that had been going on for years, and things moved very slowly by the usual means in large organizations. Bureaucracies are good at slowing things down. So that's a nice example of how nonviolent direct action can actually make things start moving. But now, of course, we can talk about the International Rebellion. You can give all these wonderful examples and nice images of Oxford Circus and Waterloo Bridge and so on. And I don't think you have to work too hard to persuade people, because they can see that immediately following these actions, Michael Gove meets with members of Extinction Rebellion. They have a debate in Parliament, and Parliament, although not admittedly government, passed the climate emergency declaration. So, you know, that's really exciting, and people can see it works. They hopefully won't need too much convincing. But it is good to tell a little bit about some of the history of that, and there's some great examples from the civil rights movement, but of course other nice examples that you might refer to, if you like, from Gandhi, from the suffragettes. It's nice to tell people, incidentally, about how just last year, they had a peaceful revolution in Armenia. And, you know, we didn't hear that much reporting about it in the UK, but they were able to bring down a government. And likewise in Iceland, not so long ago, they responded to the global financial crisis, not by bailing out the banks, but by jailing bankers and by changing the government and by nationalizing the banks. And that was because of civil resistance and non-violent direct action. So it's good to be able to give people examples of those things. Okay, so what else do I want to talk about? So there are, a lot of people mention concerns about explaining climate science. So the two key things I want to say about this are that I don't think you should be too worried. I think it's now the case that people know, right? And people know in two respects. They look around and they can see that summers are getting hotter and winters are getting hotter, and they see all of these examples of what we used to call natural disasters, not just in countries in the global south, but affecting places like the United States, where you actually get to hear about them and you get lots of coverage of them. And a lot of people have seen David Attenborough talking about these things. You know, they'll have watched the documentary that he made recently. They know that Parliament has declared a climate emergency, or at any rate, you'll tell them. And so you don't really have to work that hard to be able to persuade people that there really is a problem here. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, it's not about you being an expert. You're in the same position as someone like Greta Thunberg. It's not you saying that you're the climate scientist and you're telling people how it is. You're simply reporting what it is that the climate scientists are saying. So, you know, feel free to make use of quotations when you're doing that. You have a nice photo of a climate scientist and then their words within inverted commas. I'm always really keen to emphasize that I'm talking about what's in the IPCC report that came out in October. And people will have heard something about that. They'll have seen some of those headlines about we have 12 years left and so on. You know, again, I don't think you have to work too hard to convey that. And my feeling is that, certainly for me, a greater danger was that, because of my science background, climate science is actually quite interesting. You know, it's fascinating. And so it's very easy to find yourself in a position where you just end up geeking out on the science and say, oh, here's another thing. And you talk about all these things in science, and you can fill the entire talk about it. You know, you could go on for hours about that. And obviously that's not what you want to do. You merely need to convey enough to convince people that, yes, this is serious. So having said that, there are a few key concepts that I think it's really nice if you can convey, which aren't necessarily yet part of the public consciousness, but I think should be. And I guess I think there's four of those that I'd mention briefly. So one is about warming, or is heating, as people are starting to call it now. People are saying global heating rather than global warming. When we talk about 1.5 degrees, that maybe doesn't sound like very much. And so it's nice if you can try to, with all these points, it's good if you can make use of analogies and bring things down to a human scale so they can understand them. So I like to make an analogy with our own body temperature. You know, so people have variation in their body temperature throughout the day, and it's different across people. But if your current temperature is 1.5 degrees more than your normal mean, then that means that you've got a fever. And if it goes up to 2 or 3 degrees, then that's actually quite a severe fever. By 3 degrees, you really need to be in a hospital. And once it gets up to 4 or 5 degrees, then chances are that's going to be fatal. And you know, that's an analogy, but it's one that actually works well for our global climate system as well. Whenever you have a complex dynamic system, actually quite small differences can have a big impact. And the last time we had an ice age, the temperature was only 4 degrees less than it is now. So, you know, it's important for for people to understand that what sounds like a small number is actually quite meaningful. Another idea that I really want to try to convey to people is the idea of feedback loops. That this is what could give rise to runaway climate change. And so, you know, there's a very simple example of that to describe about the albedo effect, because it is something that everyone understands. They might not know the name, but everyone knows that if you go out on a hot day and you're wearing a white shirt, then that's going to reflect more of the sun's rays than a black shirt, and consequently, you'll be cooler if you're wearing a white shirt. And that's exactly what's happening with the Arctic ice. And so then you can explain that kind of feedback loop as the ice melts and it turns to dark ocean water, then you get more heat absorbed and the temperature goes up, and then you get into this vicious cycle. And people can understand that very easily when you give that kind of real world example of what to wear on a hot day. And related to that, you know, there's this idea that we have a bunch of different tipping points within our climate system. And I'm sure there are people who are more expert on this here than I, but who'll know about this hothouse Earth paper that came out last year, which talks about this idea of tipping cascades. That, you know, first of all, maybe the Arctic ice melts, and then that has an effect on the ocean circulation, and then that affects the Amazonian rainforest, say. And so you've got this sequence of tipping points, and each one ends up giving you just enough warming to go on to the next one. So it's like a whole set of dominoes lined up, and maybe you just need to knock the first one over in order for the rest of them to inevitably fall. And that's, again, the kind of a visual metaphor that people can understand, and explains why it is that scientists are so concerned about the you know, what might happen when we go over 1.5 degrees. And this idea of tipping points as well. You know, I like to give the analogy of a ball rolling down a hill. You know, it'll keep going until it gets to the next stable state. And you know, there's evidence that our climate works like that. That, you know, it has the different stable states. It doesn't sit between those. So once you knock yourself out of your current stable state, as we are doing, then the system will change until it gets to the next stable state. Okay, so again, in talking about those things, I don't want to put pressure on people. I don't want them to think that, oh yeah, there are these important scientific things that I have to thoroughly understand in order to be able to convey. But I think if you do want to talk about a little bit of science, it's good to think about, okay, what are the key things that maybe people don't know and that it would be nice to convey, and how can I warm those concepts up by putting them in everyday language and giving analogies that people will relate to. And I do want to make the point that, you know, I think it's really valuable to make use of this IPCC report and be able to say, look, this is what the scientists are saying. It's not what I'm saying. And please try to avoid a danger that I've seen in some versions of this talk. You know, I think if some of the versions of the talk that I've seen online, I have a slight concern that there is this message that the scientists are saying this, but actually it's much worse than that. And you know, the scientists are lying to us. And in fact, you know, where if you go into the details, then this is going to happen. And you know, in a way I'm sympathetic to that, but I think there's a great risk there of sounding a bit like a conspiracy theory and a bit like the you know, the climate change deniers. You know, they say the scientists have got it wrong, and so you can ignore all that. I think we're in a much more powerful position if we talk about what the scientific consensus is, because it's bad enough as it is. Okay, what else do I want to say? We talked a little bit about the idea of tailoring the talk. If you can, I really encourage you to try to think about any local flavor that you can introduce to the talk. So, you know, if there is a new coal mine that's going to open near you, or if there's an airport that's going to expand near you, or if there's some aspect of the local environment that has been affected by climate change, then make use of that. It's good to have things that people can directly relate to. We talked about how the talk is a vehicle for explaining the 3 demands, and make sure that you make it clear what those 3 demands are. A word about politics. I think my experience of talking to people in Extinction Rebellion is that most of us tend to be on the left of politics, and that's perhaps not so surprising. But it's really important when we give the talk that we try to keep our own politics out of it and emphasize that Extinction Rebellion is not party political. And we really do want to be able to attract people who are on the right side of politics, because this is a problem that requires everyone to respond. There's nothing party political about responding to the climate crisis. This is a problem that affects all of us. And so it's good to be inclusive about that. So I'm not saying that, you should pretend you're something you're not, but there's no need to go in there with this strong kind of allegiance to some particular side of politics. Try to think about how you can make it as broad as you can. And one way that you'll see people who've often done that in versions of this talk is they'll talk about how the idea of rebellion, it might seem like this radical left-wing kind of idea. You might associate that with Karl Marx and revolutionary figures. But actually, if you go back and you look at what someone like Thomas Hobbes said, who's this sort of grand figure in conservative thought, he's the person who made up this idea about the social contract. And the social contract says that, the reason that we give our allegiance to the king or the queen or the government is because they agree to protect us. And our government is not protecting us, they are pushing us off the cliff, and so they've broken the social contract. So that's an idea that comes from conservative thought, and it's nice to be able to express that. Different people might have different ideas about whether a social contract is the right way to think about it, but it's nice to be able to say that this is something that has some kind of political basis that is not entrenched in left-wing thinking.
Can I just bring in Chris at that point?
Thanks.
Hi, thanks, Colin. Thanks, everyone. It's a fascinating evening. I'm going to have to nash, but I'm looking forward to giving a talk soon, and this has been really, really useful. Thanks all. Cheers.
Thanks, Chris. I'm almost done. So,
just back to you.
Okay. So let me move on to just talking about some logistic stuff then. A lot of your focus will be on preparing to deliver the talk and trying to think about the best way to do that and making sure you practice and know your stuff. But in doing that, don't lose sight of some of the more mundane things. So, think about having a USB stick with a spare copy of your slides so that, when you turn up, you're not dependent upon there being an internet connection, for instance. Have some kind of backup. It's a good idea to take your own notes along, even though, I would suggest, as before, that you don't actually read from the notes, but it's a nice kind of safety blanket for you, perhaps, to think, oh yeah, I've got notes here if I should need them for anything. There is somewhere online, and I'll be able to send you a link to this, a set of references that go along with the talk. And no one is saying that you have to read all those references, but that's a useful thing to have, because if someone comes up to you afterwards and says, can you tell me more about this, then you can point them to these references and communicate to them that this isn't just something you've made up. It's really important that you have some way of signing people up after the talk. The way in which we've done that has changed a little bit over time. So until pretty recently, there was this standard form which had various questions, including questions like, are you willing to be arrested Yes, no, don't know. Are you willing to go to prison? Yes, no, don't know. And that was a very confronting thing to see. And I always tell people, make sure you only give that out at the end of the talk. Don't have it sitting on people's chairs when they first arrive. I actually liked it because it was very useful for me getting that feedback at the end of the talk, looking through these sheets and saying, oh yeah, another person going to be arrested. Makes you think, okay, and people are taking this seriously. However, we do have a different sign-up sheet now, and it's it basically is a way of getting people's details and finding out a little bit more from them about particular skills they might have. It doesn't ask them about getting arrested, and I guess that's fine. But I can send you the link to that as well. There is also an online version of that, so you could put that on a slide, or if you want to be fancy, you could have a QR code for it. But I think it's nice to have a pen and paper version as well. And occasionally when I give them the talk, people have complained that they don't have pens or they don't have clipboards. So if you're really organized, take some pens or pencils along with you and maybe even some clipboards so they can actually fill it out there. Might be a good idea to take a container along so you can solicit donations at the end of the talk to cover the venue hire. And if you're really organized, you might even bring along some signs so that you have directions in case there's any difficulty in finding the room that you're going to be in. So there's a few things to consider, some logistics kinds of things. It's also good to highlight at the end of the talk, perhaps on the final slide, some upcoming XR events. If you've got any actions coming up, make sure people know about that. Make sure people know about when the weekly meeting is, if you're in an area where they have a local meeting. If you're going somewhere where they don't currently have a local meeting, then it's good if you can have someone from that area, who hopefully maybe has helped to organize the talk, to speak for a little while at the end, just briefly, to say about plans that there might be to start a new group. And then maybe you can try to give that person advice about what could happen next with that, about getting some inductions going the next week or in a couple of weeks' time, say. I want to very briefly talk about the idea of Q&A, question and answers, because there were some concerns about that before. People worried about getting interrogated, not knowing the answers to questions. One thing that you might choose to do here is simply not to have a Q&A session. I think that's okay to do. The first time I gave, well, a couple of times I've given the talk, I haven't had any Q&A. And part of the reason for that was that I was just concerned that having so carefully tried to engineer this emotional response, then at the end, some guy gets up and wants to give a long rant about, what about the workers? Or, even worse, you get some climate denier coming along and completely, spoiling this mood you've tried to cultivate. I have to say, I've never had any problems with climate deniers, so I don't think you should worry about that. And I haven't really had any problems with people wanting to change the conversation either. So, my current advice is that I actually like having a question and answer session. I think it's really useful. And I think you can often anticipate the kinds of questions that people have, and it's a good chance to have a bit more of a discussion going. But if you're worried about that, then it's perfectly reasonable to get to the end of the talk, have another minute's silence, and then encourage people once again to talk to their neighbor, or possibly even get into groups of 4 or 5 or 6 people and have little chats. Hopefully you'll have some other Extinction Rebellion people there. It's a lot easier if you do. And then people can come and talk to you and to them and find out a little bit more. So it's fine not to have a Q&A if you don't want to do that. Okay, I think the last thing I want to say is that, I've tried to download a lot of information, and I may have given you the impression that this is a really scary and difficult talk to give. And it's not an easy talk to give. But the thing I want to leave you with is that it's a very rewarding talk to give. People will thank you for it. And the biggest reward that you'll get is that at some point after giving the talk, you will meet someone who is running a stall or giving out flyers or helping produce banners or doing who knows what. And they'll say to you, I got involved with XR after coming to your talk, so thanks. And, you know, that's extremely rewarding. And that's why we have to go out and deliver talks and bring more people into Extinction Rebellion. So thank you very much for coming on to this and being prepared to do that. For people who can stick around for a little bit longer, I will open up a Q&A session for any questions that people do have.
I have to go, but thank you so much. This has been great. I really hope that I can get an opportunity to give the talk and use all the stuff that you've said. It's just been so handy, but I've got to go now. So thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
I'm also going to get going now. Thank you so much. It's been great. See you guys.
And thanks for facilitating.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I need to go soon too.
Thanks, Anne. Bye. If everyone wants to go, then that's fine too. We don't have to have questions.
I'm going to dash as well. Thanks a lot. There's loads to take in there, Colin. And it's been amazing to see it. I think it's quite a fun journey because I saw your video on the Bristol website, and then 2 days later you were waiting for me outside Bromley police station after I'd been arrested. It was like the perfect closed loop. So it's been great carrying on the journey, and thanks a lot.
Great. I look forward to talking to you more.
Cool. See you later.
Bye. Okay. Well, I think probably we're just about done. And I mean, if anyone did have a pressing question, then I'm happy to stick around. Otherwise, thanks very much for coming along, and I hope your talks go really well. And I have put my email address there, so do feel free to send me an email and ask me any questions, but also tell me how you got on with your talk. I'd be interested to hear about that. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Colin. And if I get any questions, it's the talksandtraining.xr Bristol is the email address.
Yes, that's right. I mean, there is a private email address that I'll put in as well, just because I've only recently set up this Proton email address and I'm a little bit skeptical about it. So there's another one which gets directly to me, pscjd@bristol.ac.uk.
Okay, I shall stick that in my file. Right, lovely, thank you very much, and I hope I'm sure your help will make it go very well. Bye.
It'll be great.
Bye.
Have fun.
Thanks.
All right, thanks everyone. Bye.
Oh, quick question. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Very quick question, Colin. Thank you so much for that. It was amazing. It's just wondering, there's been a few sort of dialogues going backwards and forwards here. Is there a way that we can share each other's contact details? I haven't met any of the other people in Edinburgh yet.
Yeah.
So I know we're obviously sending our email addresses to you. Is there a way that we could share amongst ourselves contact details? I'm happy to share mine.
Yes, good question. Asked this before.
Yeah, it's a little bit late, isn't it? A few people have gone. Perhaps an email to everyone to say, are you happy for your email to be shared? And that way, I've got a specific request you'll see from Anne, for Anne, I should say. So yeah, it'd be nice to be able to follow that up, and the other XR members in Edinburgh as well. We need to go to Bristol to connect with each other up here.
Yeah, come to Bristol. Okay, so that's a great idea. I'll wait till I get people's email addresses, and then I'll email. I'll send an email, and I'll suggest to people that if they're happy for everyone's email address to be shared, then instead of putting it in blind copy, I'll carbon copy, and then you'll have everyone's email address.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you.
Ashley, did you have a question or something you wanted to talk about?
No, I was just about to go, but I thought, well, there was a question. I just listened to what it was, and I'm okay with my email being used. But I'll send it to you. And it's the talks that training. That's the email address that's the email address for us to send our emails to that we have been on the training session.
Yes. Thanks.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.
Bye. I think that just leaves Bill. Is Bill still there? No, Bill's gone now as well. Okay. Right. I'm signing out. Bye, everyone.